Good morning and welcome to the 17th meeting of the committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off mobile phones and all other electronic equipment, please? Agenda item 1. Our first item is to consider whether to take agenda item 5 in private. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is the budget strategy phase 2014-15. Today we'll be having an oral evidence session as part of our pre-budget scrutiny of the Scottish Government's 2014-15 draft budget. The purpose of this pre-budget scrutiny is to both look back at the challenges faced by local authorities in recent years and look forward over the next few years. We're aiming to examine the big picture, looking at high-level local government budget information rather than focusing on individual local authority allocations or a particular aspect of local government responsibility. The evidence we receive from this pre-budget scrutiny will feed directly into our formal budget scrutiny in autumn 2013, enabling us to better scrutinise and influence the government's budget proposals. We have 3 panels of witnesses this morning, so I'd like to start by welcoming our first panel. We have John Bailey, Chair of the Accounts Commission for Scotland, Gordon Smale, Portfolio Manager, Best Value and Scrutiny Improvements for the Accounts Commission for Scotland, and Anthony Clark, Assistant Director of Audit Scotland. Can I advise members that we need to conclude this panel by 10:15, as Mr Bailey is also giving evidence to the Public Audit Committee this morning. A busy man, Mr Bailey.
It feels that way.
Indeed. Can I ask if you'd like to make an opening statement, please?
Thank you, Convener. I have a very short opening statement. Sessions such as this are now an established part of the Accounts Commission's work, and we welcome the opportunity to discuss the challenges facing local government with the committee. We hope that this helps the committee in its work, particularly in relation to the budget strategy that you're considering. Previous overview reports from the Accounts Commission have identified the pressures facing local government. This year, our report focuses on how councils are responding and what more needs to be done. Councils are managing their finances in challenging economic circumstances, and so far, they are coping well. Among the many changes they face, they are placing due importance on the significance of welfare reform and its implications for communities and people. There are good examples of partnership working, but there is a long way to go before the full potential of community planning is realised. And overall, councils are facing tougher challenges and more change in the years ahead. Our report identifies key recommendations that the Commission believes, if implemented effectively, will make a real difference to Council's prospects. And we set these out in straightforward terms on page 4 of our report under 4 headings of leadership and governance, working in partnership, service changes, and performance, information and management. Achieving best value is crucial, as our report says, and indeed we've been saying now for about 3 years. Councils that place best value at the centre of all they do are well placed to deal with the challenges and change. We are, of course, happy to take any questions that the committee may wish to ask.
Thank you very much. I don't know if any of your colleagues want to add anything to that. Okay, thank you. If I could start off, I think one of the surprising things from your report is that you say that reserves have increased. And you rightly go on to say that they can be used only once and are not a sustainable source. I think it is quite surprising for some of us that reserves have increased during these tough times. Is this a case of a number of underspends which were not supposed to happen, or is this a case of actually planning for the future?
If I may say so, Convener, it's a very good question. It's one that we've tried to look at. I think there's a general feeling that councils are trying to be prudent in the face of the maelstrom of cuts and future demands on services. That seems to be the general picture. The other aspect is that each council has its own policy on reserves, and there's some are quite different from others. and the extent to which they'll put aside things for a rainy day, for example. That varies. I'll leave Gordon to develop that, though, because he has studied it in some detail.
Thank you, Mr. Smale.
Yes, I think Mr. Bailey's captured the main point, and one of the things we like to emphasise is that we don't have to go back that many years where we didn't have very good information about local government reserves. There was a figure in the accounts, but what we've been able to do over the years is to get behind that and to encourage more information, and there's certainly more information available that helps us to understand the picture. I think there's a number of reasons. There is evidence of underspending, and in some councils they are rebuilding from a position maybe a few years ago to have money available to meet unplanned items that may come up. And I think it's always worth bearing in mind, while the figures are large, as we say in the report, the actual amount that is unearmarked, as we call it, i.e. the free element of the reserves, the part of the reserves that's not set aside for other things, is relatively small at about 334 million, which is about 2.7% of net spend. And to put that into other terms, maybe more sort of accessible, if you like, is the fact that 334 million really represents only 6 or 7 days spend for councils. So I think it's good to keep it in that context. But just to finish off, the main thing I think from our point of view is about having good quality information for elected members and councils to have good quality information to ask officers as to what the policy is in reserves and where does that lead them, what does this mean for the overall management of the council. But also, as we say in the report, and to pick up on your point, Convener, that there is plenty of information available to the public as to why, again, in a time where finances are coming under pressure and likely to come under more pressure, these reserves are there. So telling the public, telling communities why are holding reserves, why have they built up, and what are councils actually going to do with them in future.
Before I bring in Mr. Stevenson, I think one of the confusing things for members of the public in particular is the committed reserves versus the uncommitted reserves. On how many occasions have we seen of late a move between committed back to uncommitted because of changes of policy?
Yeah, I think we've seen movements in both directions. To be honest with you, Exhibit 21 in the report. Part of the point in doing that is just really to reflect the wide variation there is amongst councils. Some councils have certainly moved from commitment to uncommitment and to non-earmarked. And we've seen stuff in the other direction, as I say, as well. But I think it's the wide variation. And I think it comes back to the point I was making earlier about just making sure that the information about reserves is open and there's transparency in use of reserves, why they're there and what they're going to be done, what's going to happen to them. But also a strong sense throughout this report of just giving elected members the information they need to ask these questions locally of finance officers and councils.
And do you monitor those switches over? Because, you know, at some points, some folk have said that there have been moves from committed to uncommitted, which are maybe unwise. In the past, many of those roundabout equal pay and modernisation, single status.
Yeah, there is, I have to say that in terms of the accounting side of things, I mean, there's no technical underpinning for what differentiates between earmarked and non-earmarked. So there'll be local decisions about that and things may switch over time. And I think that's why it's vitally important that councillors have good information about things such as the very point you're raising, Convener, about where there have been movements, and then for them to be able to ask these questions locally, because it will vary very much from council to council.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey?
Perhaps I could just add a supplement, which is that sometimes the very disclosure of a reserve is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If those who are interested in what you've set aside for a particular event are interested in receiving the money for that particular event, then it's always part of their strength of negotiation to see that. So there's sometimes some difficulty in councils being too specific about some of the reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. I think that was very useful. Mr. Stevenson.
Thank you. Before I perhaps talk about councillors, I just want to pick up something that's just been said about me, Convener. If you were a commercial company, you would in your accounts have to provide figures for liabilities and contingent liabilities, a council's not in exactly the same position.
Yes, they are. I'll leave Gordon Smale and Anthony Clark to follow me up again. Yeah, yes, they are. And of course, as you know, contingent liabilities are just that, and the extent to which you disclose the likelihood of a provision in due course for it is again something requiring deft touch to enable to avoid necessarily triggering the very liability you're just talking about as a contingency. But yes, is the answer. Yes, is the answer to your question.
But of course, a contingent liability
is not
you do not provide financial cover for.
You don't, but you nonetheless refer to it in a note so that the reader can take it into account in his or her view whether it should be something.
I don't think I need more on that.
Right,
I just wanted to be clear that there wasn't difference in the way, because the accounting rules, I think, are
very similar.
Yeah.
Almost the same, in fact.
Yeah. No, I wanted to just pick up on what Mr. Smale said about, I think, good information for councillors. And looking at Appendix 1, which is a whole series of action points for councillors, I want to put it to you and get your response that these action points, and perhaps what's been captured by saying good information for councillors, suggests that you see the role of councillors purely as monitoring what is done by officials. The word leadership only seems to appear, well, it appears under leadership and governance, although not in the text of that part of the table, only appears under service changes, where are you satisfied how your council and its partners are leading public sector reform? Are you actually seeing in practice that councillors are much more focused on monitoring and much less focused on innovating and leading and changing, driving change through?
I think it varies by council. We would certainly always say that councillors should be very keen to see that the aims and the objects of the policies of the council are clearly articulated and plans put in place to support that. I think what's happened here is that in terms of this particular appendix, yes, there's a lot to do with monitoring, but it's not in any way to preclude or de-emphasise the very important need for councillors to start further up the line with what they're all about as a council. I don't know if Anthony, in terms of the information.
Given we've limited time, perhaps
yes, okay.
we'll not go too deep.
Okay.
Just finally then, do you think councillors are supported sufficiently to enable them to lead? Because unlike, you know, us members of the Scottish Parliament who have assistants who are working to us and supporting our agenda, councillors by and large are doing their own correspondence to varying degrees. They're paid, frankly, a pittance. And the support they appear to get is pretty modest. If you're a convener of a finance committee, you're probably getting some support, but in the generality, not very much. Is that impacting the ability of councillors to, as you say, under service challenges, lead public sector reform?
It can do. I'll leave Gordon and Anthony to perhaps to elaborate on that.
Most local authorities will have member support units that provide support to elected members and policy units that provide guidance as well. I think the point I want to make is there's a very important role for members and officers working together to productively make sure that the direction that's set by elected members is actually executed in practice. It's difficult to give a specific answer to your question though, Mr Stevenson, because all councils have different organisational structures and different levels of resourcing. But I don't think in our overview report, or indeed in some of the work we've done in our How Councils Work Effectively series of reports, we've seen significant evidence of an absence of support for members that should be causing them to have difficulties exercising their proper leadership role.
But let me just put a number on it as my very final contribution, convener. We in Scotland have the lowest number of elected politicians of any country in Europe per head of population at 33.5 per 100,000. England's 42, France is something like 75, etc. And yet, we appear to expect the councillors to operate semi-independently. Member support units are global rather than focused on individual members. Given that we've got the lowest number of elected members, should we be looking at whether we need to have greater support in consequence of that?
I think it's a fair point you raise, and I would expect that the effective chief executive and his or her staff would be looking to just that. One of the very first report we issued called How Councils Work, which is a state-of-the-art type thing, stressed the need for effective working relationships between councillors and senior officers and among councillors. And part of that is providing the right level of support as councillors needed. If that means that senior staff are overworked, then senior staff have to do something about that. So in a sense, I'm agreeing with your general thrust.
Thank you. I think it would be very interesting to find out how much support there is in each council, because I know that it differs dramatically. And you know, it may well be that some folk are particularly well serviced and others are not quite so.
That back and see if we could provide any information.
I think that would be useful. Thank you, Mr. Bailey. John Pentland, please.
Thank you, Convener. I would probably like to tailor my questions on some comments that you've made in the past to see whether things have improved since then or indeed worsened. And if we go back to 2009, Mr. Bailey, you said that with regards to council buildings in their poor and bad condition, and you then said while cutting building maintenance may seem attractive, it won't help in the medium to long term, as it just makes backlogs worse and leads to higher costs. Now, given the subsequent budget cuts, how badly are the building conditions suffering now?
If I can talk, include in my comment other aspects of infrastructure such as roads, because it's again indicative of the thrust of your question. I actually don't today have in my head the detail of the building's condition, but the general thrust seems to be that only repairs that are needed are being done. And you would expect that. Our concern is always that today's small repair is tomorrow's large repair, with much more expense associated with it. Perhaps I could ask Gordon, do you want to take that?
Similar, I'm in a similar position. I don't have detail. We do monitor this. So there's a couple of measures, for example, in my terms, if you like, in terms of how fit for purpose buildings are. And I don't have the information with you. We can supply that to you. We've also been doing some work in the last year about major capital projects in councils, which we've been looking at how things are taking forward in that side of things as well. And of course, roads is very closely linked to that, and there was a report quite recently. So we've got information on that, but undoubtedly the overall position is one where the pressure on finances is leading to deferral of maintenance.
It's part of what I've bored committees before with by saying it's part of what I call a dangling debit. It's just there waiting to happen at some point, only it's getting bigger with every year that passes.
Mr. Pentland.
Okay, can I ask one question and then maybe summarise? Another comment that you had made was that given that local government is a labour-intensive sector, budget cuts make staff's cuts inevitable. Now, in the past you've warned this could lead to key skills being lost, and recently you have highlighted that public bodies spent £561 million on losing 14,000 staff. What impact has this had on the skill base, and could this money have been better spent?
This, again, if I may just strike, goes right to the heart of the issues in councils particularly. We do advocate that councils need to sit down, look at their aims, look at where they want to go, and what is their workforce strategy as a consequence. We don't see necessarily too much of a workforce strategy that stretches 3 or 4 or 5 years. And of course, if they don't, then the very point you make is then encountered. That is, they don't have the skills and capacity in the right places at the right time to address what they want to try to do. So that in itself is a gap. So far, in terms of those who have left, the people leaving have been more in that category who have been ready to leave. We're now at the stage with councils where probably not as many people there are keen to leave or ready to leave as there has been in the past. So that will be now a dwindling market in terms of voluntary release.
Mr. Pentland.
Thank you for your comments, but I sometimes find that organisations such as yours and others have a good habit of sort of lobbing the grenades into you know, into the mix. And I think, as Pat Waters rightly said, talk is cheap, but it's action that costs. And with that in mind, do you then believe that even if the council share of the Scottish budget had been maintained with a fully funded council tax freeze, that we would not be nearly as bad off?
Well, that's almost into the area of policy, which we always make a point of not commenting on. But just to try to be helpful, I think when we say we need a long-term workforce strategy, that is our role in this. And until councils have a workforce strategy along the lines I'm explaining, I think it's very difficult for them to know what skills they need and therefore what people they can afford to release. It's for councils to perform the actions, to take the specific decisions as a separate local elected democracy. As for the Concordat that was reached 5 years ago now, that is a political matter on which we do not comment.
Mr. Smale.
I just would like to add something. I think to pick up on what Ms. Pentland's saying there is, I think there's a valid challenge to us there about taking this forward. It's all very well reporting it, and I just wanted to let the committee know that we're actually doing a piece of work just now in Audit Scotland for the Commission and the Auditor General called Reshaping Scotland's Public Sector Workforce, and that will be looking at whether public bodies are effectively managing changes to the workforce, which I think will get to the very heart of the type of issues that you're raising in terms of what does that mean in terms of service delivery, because at the end of the day, that's the crucial thing.
That's due out later this year.
October 2013, we've got a date for that.
Okay, Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Just a couple of questions. In the report, on paragraphs 25 and 26 in particular, I mean, you talk about the welfare reform. Am I safe to assume that the likes of the Accounts Commission will certainly be keeping a close eye on welfare reform as it progresses?
Very much so. As you know, I'm sure the councils see this as one of the major challenges they face, and so far they've gone about addressing it quite attentively as they've had to, but we'll be monitoring that quite closely as time goes past.
What type of actions do you actually see yourselves undertaking in terms of your reviewing mechanism?
Well, it will be included in in the audit work that Audit Scotland do for us, and perhaps leave Gordon or Anthony to elaborate on that for you.
We have already identified this as being a big issue in the community planning partnership audits works that we did earlier this year, and we've seen some good examples of councils such as Scottish Borders working with the third sector, social housing and others to try and make sure that people are aware of the changes that are happening to welfare reform and mitigate the risks for communities. So it's obviously going to be a theme that we'll be picking up as part of our community planning partnership audit work as we move forward. It's also likely that we'll pick up on it in our best value audits when we do best value audits of local authorities as well, given the central role that local authorities have in terms of managing and dealing with the DWP over these reforms.
Mr. Smale, you wanted to come in
just
there?
add a wee bit again, just add a bit more depth to that. The Commission actually has called on us to bring forward reports. We took a report to the Commission actually just earlier this month about the state of preparedness of councils and how they're dealing with welfare reform that looked at a whole number of issues, including referring to the amount of money that's been taken out of local economies and the questions what that may mean in the longer term, but also looking at some of the sort of nuts and bolts issues for councils in terms of what they're doing, how they're working together, how seriously they're taking it. As we say in this report, they are taking it very seriously, both in terms of the impact on themselves, in terms of their own workforce and what they can be expected to do. Looking a bit wider about what this may mean in terms of council house building and smaller units to smaller numbers of bedrooms and the like in there, but also in terms of the wider issues about welfare reform and the potential, as we put in here, for increasing demands on other services, because most vulnerable people are affected by this, perhaps presenting more to voluntary organisations and to councils for support through this. And the Commission have given us a very clear steer that they want us to keep on top of this and to bring back progress reports, and we'll do that over time. These are public documents as well, so they're on their website.
Answer, Mr. Smale. You mentioned the house building. Is there any evidence thus far of councils? So let's face it, when a council wants to build any houses, it takes a period of time, a lengthy period of time for plans to be drawn up and then go through the process. Has there been any indication of councils changing their plans midway through or part way through. So as a consequence of that, then additional costs have actually been borne to that particular local authority.
Mr. Smale.
We don't. I mean, obviously we're auditors. We look for evidence. We're just picking up what we're hearing, and clearly it's had an impact. And we know anecdotally that councils are looking at their capital plans and looking at what the impact might be and what the demand might be for housing going ahead.
Okay, no, I'm fine.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, you mentioned there the good practice that's going on in the Scottish borders. We as a committee often hear about good practice. Are there any councils at this moment in time that are not moving forward quickly enough? Are there examples of bad practice or no change?
We haven't done work across all 32 local authorities to put me in a position to give you an answer to that question, Mr. Stewart, I'm afraid. Okay, but clearly it's some of the work we'll be doing in terms of keeping an overview of welfare reform on behalf of the Commission.
I wonder, in terms of your findings, how you are actually conveying your findings to all 32 local authorities to make sure that they are aware of the good practice that's going on and hopefully can pick up on that.
We're doing a number of things, actually. We obviously present the findings from our reports to networks like the Community Planning Managers Network. We've been to committees of Parliament like yourselves, and also we're engaging with COSLA and SOLIS as well to make sure that councils, in terms of the top leadership groups, are aware of our findings. And we do try and publish and make publicly available and communicate the findings from our reports through our engagement with the media as well.
Okay, thank you. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. In the first part of your report, Service Challenges Exhibit 2, under resource pressures and economic pressures, you cite reduced income from non-domestic rates. Now, I have a SPICE brief in front of me here with the latest kind of figures, which show from 1999 to 2000, the non-domestic rate income contributable amount was 1,497 million, rising to 2012-13, a figure of 2,362 million. How do these two kind of statements equate?
I think I've seen the SPICE briefing that came through this morning. I think this is what is anticipated in terms of improvements in business. There's other things like the TIF arrangements, the new arrangements for financing capital, which are predicated on improving the non-domestic rate side of things. I think our exhibit in this report is looking at it from the point of view of at a time now, or certainly in the last couple of years, where we've seen a lot of evidence of businesses closing down, and therefore our assumption would have been that the non-domestic rate income as a result of that would have reduced as well. But I think looking at the SPICE briefing and what government are saying, there's an expectation that non-domestic rate income will increase, and things like TIF are intended to contribute towards that.
So to understand you properly, it's they anticipated if everyone paid 100%, that every building there that had non-domestic rates, that would be the figure, the SPICE figure.
I think what they're doing is projecting what the non-domestic rate income would be across the piece for Scotland going in the years ahead. Because, as you know, what happens is it's all drawn back to the centre and then redistributed by central government. So I think the projections are about non-domestic rate income increasing by dint of a number of initiatives that are being taking place both locally and nationally to try and improve the yield from non-domestic rates.
And yet the income is falling, and that's cited as one of the resource pressures.
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to do here is to reflect the pressures as we see them overall in the economy and how that moves forward. I think these new figures that are coming through are suggesting that things will improve, particularly in the medium to longer term.
Would it be possible to perhaps give the committee more of a background, maybe send it in, of exactly why there seems to be a discrepancy between the amount that could potentially...
I think it's primarily, it's a fair point, and I think it's primarily a timing issue, as I'm maybe not getting across as well as I might do. But I'll have a look at that and see if we can come back to the committee.
Mr. Clark, I think you were wanting to come in there, were you? No, I beg your pardon.
I noticed that you have a section on ALIOs and just trying to monitor these properly. In terms of the status of ALIOs, are some of them charitable in status?
There's a wide range. I think it's fair to say there are some that are charitable. This is an area that is exercising the Commission quite a lot just now. We're really quite concerned at the extent to which public money is put beyond scrutiny on the performance side. Scrutiny on the financial side still exists because, of course, these ALIOs appoint their own auditors for the accounts, etc. But it's the performance side that is concerning us, particularly when there are activities which are not regulated. I mean, regulated would be the home care would be, that's regulated, so that's the performance is regulated there or reviewed, but some are not, and it's concerning us quite a lot. That.
Just going back to my last point, if they are, they do have charitable status, perhaps I know some leisure trusts, etc., do they pay non-domestic rates?
Mr. Bailey? Oh, Mr. Smale, I think you...
Yeah. That's one of the things that's cited in terms of the advantage of moving things like leisure services into trusts is that the non-domestic rates are not due on charities, so charitable organisations, and many of the trusts are set up in that way. So one of the points is to try and reduce that tax, if you like, burden.
So when we're looking at this SPICE figure, this would say a leisure complex that no longer is in an ALIO and doesn't pay non-domestic rates because it's charitable status, would that be included in that figure?
That could be a contributory factor. I mean, that's the type of thing that we need to look at and see what information we've got to be able to come back to you. But that would be one of the advantages that's cited by councils of moving to that particular model of delivery of things like leisure services is the savings they can make by not having to make payments in non-domestic rates. So that would have an effect. Off the top of my head, and without looking at figures and things like that, I reckon it will be a relatively small contributory factor to that.
It would be useful to get that information, as you can appreciate, because if it's arm's length, if I'm understanding it properly, then and no non-domestic rates are paid, then I suppose that means the income isn't potentially coming back to the local authorities.
That's correct, yes.
That would be very interesting to look at. I also note that you've got reducing income from planning and building control fees, but it was my understanding that both planning fees and building control fees were rising if they haven't already risen.
I think that would be the similar type of response I had on the non-domestic rates. It'll be a timing issue, but we can certainly look at that as well and see what information is available on this. I think overall what we were trying to do in the exhibit that you're referring to is just to give that overall sense of the types of things that were, if you like, as we show in the diagram, squeezing council services from both sides. And certainly, if you look at what's been happening over the last few years, things like non-domestic rates, undoubtedly planning income will have been coming down in the last couple of years because of less building going on. But in terms of how that now looks and going ahead, what the projections might be, I'll see what information we have and we'll come back to you.
Empty properties, of course, is a key factor for the non-domestic rate income falling. Just one last question that was on CPPs and the emphasis on outcomes. The committee's been very concerned about the performance of community planning partnerships. Are you satisfied that outcomes are being measured effectively?
I think the measurement of outcomes is one of the most difficult parts of any job for an investigator or auditor. We can measure efficiency, we can measure, but measuring effectiveness is the other end of that, and it's a much softer area to report on. But nonetheless, Anthony Clark and his team have been doing a lot of work in that area. I think probably what we've done so far, to touch on something that was said earlier, is report on the three particular Pathfinder projects. Now, one of the groups that looks at that is the new National Community Planning Partnership Group, and they are tasked with then taking those reports and seeing what they can do about them, both specifically and more generically, using the improvement service. There's quite a lot of targeting going on as a direct consequence of those reports. Pat Waters, who chairs that group, described it as a call to arms to get things moving. And so there's a lot of action is being sought on this.
Mr Clark, do you want to come in briefly on that one?
The committee will be aware when we came and spoke to you about public service reform and community planning more generally in partnerships, we highlighted the fact that we had quite significant concerns about the range and quality and reliability of information that was available for monitoring performance by community planning partnerships. Our evidence from the 3 early audits and other work we've done previously indicates that single outcome agreements haven't been a particularly efficient vehicle for performance management and assessing whether or not the activities that community planning partnerships are committing to are actually delivering real change on the ground and improving outcomes for communities and citizens. So at the strategic level, we have some concerns about that aspect of CPP performance. We also highlighted in both the local and national reports concerns about the extent to which CPPs are actually understanding what difference projects are making. So if they have particular projects that are focused on, say, crime and disorder or improving health outcomes and addressing health inequalities, we found that there are often weaknesses in the way in which the CPPs and the partners working together were understanding whether or not those projects were actually working and being effective in delivering change and providing value for money. So we have concerns at both the strategic and operational level about where community planning partnerships are at the moment.
Just finally returning to the non-domestic rates income, have you had any kind of feedback or any concern from councils that there is uncertainty about how much they're going to get as a result of the review and the business rate incentivisation scheme? I think that was due to the number of appeals. The government is now saying that the targets previously set were probably not accurate, and they want to change them so that there'll be less money available. Has that come into your...
We've heard some anecdotal evidence that councils are concerned about the uncertainty and want matters clarified. I think, do you want to elaborate?
I don't think there's anything we can add. We'll certainly look at that rounder picture as part of the commitment to come back to you about the position you're referring to.
So you haven't quantified how much that would
be
in terms? I could probably give you some information on that.
Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, just it was to Anthony Clark. You mentioned there about some of the work that you're doing with CPPs. Some of that information that you had mentioned, some of the work that's going on, is that public information? Are we able to read the findings of it?
Mr Clark.
Yes, we've published the 3 local reports on the North Ayrshire CPP, Aberdeen City CPP and Scottish Borders CPP, and we published the national report called Improving Community Planning in Scotland, so they are publicly available, yes.
Thank you.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Just to go back to the Exhibit 2 in the Audit Commission's paper, the resource pressures, and it's just to seek clarification. Now, the third bullet point down in resource pressures, you make reference to early release costs, which we've already covered, and we've seen your report that was produced and highlighted in the media. But you've also got equal pay commitments. Now, my understanding is equal pay commitments are 14 years old now. These commitments actually were supposed to be dealt with in 1999. Do we still have a number of local authorities who still have not settled in relation to equal pay? And I'm talking about equal pay, not single status here.
Mr Bailey.
Well,
Mr Smale.
Gordon has a detail.
This is something we're monitoring closely, and I think is an important area, and it's over a long period of time. What we've got are the figures in terms of how much it's cost to date, but there's certainly, from our understanding, there's likely to be more in the system. Insofar as, going back to Mr Stevenson's comment about how it's accounted for, we've got the costs that are known, what's been paid out. There are provisions set aside for known amounts that are due to be paid and will be paid at some point in the future. But there are contingent liabilities in councils' accounts, and these are the ones where it's not possible to quantify, but there's a recognition that there may be some more payments to be made. So some councils have not settled. There's also the uncertainty about some ongoing legal cases and how that may affect things that have already been settled, and the possibility of reopening things that have been thought to have been dealt with in the past. So I don't think it's the end of the story yet, is what I'm saying.
I once equated equal pay settlements as like a taximeter. For every minute and every hour you go on, the rate just ratchets up. And it's whether or not local authorities do have enough resource reserve to actually meet the total commitment that may be liable to the local authorities in terms of equal pay. And are you confident that the local authorities do have enough money set aside to meet those commitments?
As far as we can assess just now, but as you've just said, every time there's something else goes on, time passes and some new feature appears and there's the kind of retrospective review of what's happened beforehand. So it's awfully difficult to be precise about it. But as far as we know, they've provided properly for it at the moment, as best they can.
Okay. I'm going to take a very brief supplementary from Stuart Stevenson. A brief answer, please, because I'm aware that Mr Wilson has another question or two.
I just wanted to be clear what you were meaning by contingent liability, because a little alarm bell rang in what you said. Are councils actually using contingent liability rather than, as I would understand, for things that may happen if something in the future happens? Are they actually using it for things where they know it's going to happen, they just don't know when? Because that would be a misuse of contingent liability.
As you know, there are very clear definitions in accounting terms as to what constitutes a contingent liability, and there's no evidence anywhere in the local authority world that they are not reporting matters as they should.
That's fine.
Okay. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Just very briefly, Nico P. I think most councils have made some kind of movement towards making contributions, except South Lanarkshire, who always said that they have a separate scheme which is bulletproof, if you like, and yet they've lost appeal after appeal. It's going to the Supreme Court. At what point, if at all, does Audit Scotland say how much public money is going to be spent in this if it looks as though they're losing the case at every step of the way?
Well, the brief answer, responding to the chair's, the convener's exhortation generally, the brief answer would be that it's for the local authority, whoever it might be, to justify their treatment in the accounts, and for the auditors then to evaluate whether that treatment presents a true and fair position. Am I being too general and too glib with that? If I am, forgive me.
I think given the potential liabilities there, then I would imagine the auditors may be concerned about what the potential outcome could be, and I wonder therefore if there's a question of balance in mitigating that.
Well, I think in essence, if there's a real liability, then that has to be booked and recognised in the accounts.
Right to you for some more clarification on this. Okay. Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. The next question, still on resource pressures, is the fifth bullet point, borrowing commitments. Now, looking at the SPICE paper, page 14, we see from that paper in the graph that's presented, PPP, PF5 projects. We have not seen the costs of those reaching its peak yet. The peak will arise, according to this, in 2025-2026. What pressure is that putting on local authority expenditure and resources in meeting the commitments from the PFI PPP projects that were commissioned in the past?
I'll ask my colleagues to elaborate, but it will put significant pressure on resources for the reasons that you indicate behind your question. I'm sorry to go back to, but this is the biggest dangling debit we have at the moment. This is not going to go away, and it's just going to have to be funded and faced.
Before your colleagues answer, could you confirm, Mr Bailey, that this, as you've indicated, is an economic pressure and one of the largest economic pressures on local authorities at the present moment, and what has a larger impact in local authority expenditure than just about any other commitment at the present moment?
Mr Bailey.
Well, I think what I'm saying is that I'm agreeing with your point that this will grow and become a bigger chunk as time goes past, and it will grow from what it is just now in accordance with the terms of the contract.
I'm aware, gentlemen, that we're very pushed for time now. Does Mr Clark or Mr Smale want to come in on this? Mr Smale.
I think at a very high level, the point is well made. The point here is about just how much flexibility will there be in councils' budgets going ahead. And the more that you have to set money aside right at the start for things like PPP would, of course, limit the flexibility. So the more that there's a first call on the money in budgets, the less flexibility the councils will have to make the kind of shifts that they need to over the next few years.
Sir Clark, do you want to add to that?
To add to that.
Okay. It has to be
very
brief,
very
Mr.
tiny
Wilson.
question, and this goes back to reducing staff numbers that you've put in pressures. We mentioned earlier the ALIOs. We know that staff get transferred from local authorities to ALIOs. How much is that impacting on the reducing number of staff members? Because we have had academics who have cited figures about staff losses in local government but there's no indication whether or not those staff losses are due to early release or due to transfer to Alios.
We don't have the detail of that, but we're looking at it just now, in fact, because it's a chunky figure, and we're happy to try to come back with you with some figures once we've seen what the story is, if we can.
I think that would be extremely useful if we could get that information once you've gathered it up. Could I thank you very much for your evidence today? I realise, Mr. Bailey, that you've got to now run to public audit. I suspend this meeting for 5 minutes to change witnesses. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I'd now like to welcome Professor David Bell, Professor of Economics at the University of Stirling, and Professor Richard Kerley, Professor of Management at Queen Margaret University. Gentlemen, would you like to make some opening remarks? Who's going first? Professor Bell, your mic came on first there.
I think I'm first alphabetically anyway. In relation to local authority budgets going forward, what it seems to me is that we're now feeling the full effects of effectively cascades coming down from the austerity budgets which the UK coalition government has been following for the last, or since 2010. The Institute for Fiscal Studies projects that as a share of GDP, departmental expenditure limits in 2017-18, I think it will be back to 1998 levels as a share of national income. So that means that effectively all of the increases in its share during the noughties, as they're called, will be rolled back by 1718. And of course, as far as local government is concerned, certainly at an English level, it's been adversely affected by the protection of the budgets on health, overseas aid, and going forward also schools, which is interesting because the pressures on schools in England are greater than the pressures in Scotland due to them having had a baby boom earlier than the current boom that we're experiencing in Scotland, and also a bigger boom. So there are intense pressures on school education in England. This rolls through to the Scottish budget via the Barnett formula, all of these changes. And what we see are significant real falls in the amount of a resource available to local government. Now, what we mean by real falls, I think, is an open question, because people tend to take that in relation to prices. But as far as local government is concerned, their main expenditure is on wages, and we've seen a period where wages have been frozen or near frozen for a long period of time. So we might think, well, that's not necessarily going to have a negative effect on the output of local government, but it does, as some of the papers that we've seen for today, lead to demoralisation of staff. It may also lead to the better people leaving. Although it's difficult to assess that, what we really mean by a real fall, it does seem to me that the reduction in budgets obviously does create real pressures on the ability of local government to produce services. In respect of all of this, the spending review, which will be released on June 29th, is going to again be critical. That will be looking, I think, only at 2015-16, because the way that budget timing, election timing kicks in, there will have to be another spending review almost immediately after the 2015 election at UK level. But again, from what we've heard in the press over the last few days, there is, although much manoeuvring amongst UK governments, departments around which departments are to take the largest hits, it does appear unlikely to me that local government at English level certainly will be protected. One of the things I would also like to draw attention to is something I've never understood, which is, and again it touches on some of the papers and maybe some of the discussion we'll have later on, how resources are transferred from NHS budgets into local government to support long-term care. We're moving to a world in which chronic conditions are going to be much more important, well, not much necessarily more important, but have a greater weight than acute conditions. So the issue of paying for care is going to be extremely important going forward. And in a sense, how we resource that by possibly transferring money from the NHS, which is primarily focused on acute care, towards local government, which has the responsibility for long-term care to a large extent, is an important issue going forward. Again, touching on some of the papers submitted to the committee, it was interesting, the discussion by the third sector around the loss of the cooperative approach towards the provision of services that was implicit in the Christie Commission. effectively what we see, I think, are local governments exerting their market power, and they are in a dominant position as far as the third sector is concerned. And until you get some change in that situation, then you're always going to find, it seems to me, local government pushing their potential suppliers as hard as they can. That's probably enough to
Sir Bell.
be going on with.
Second in the alphabet, we have Professor Kerley. I'll do Robson's rotation next time. Professor Kerley.
I'd like to draw the committee's attention to a few observations I made, Convener, but I'm happy to cover, in response to questions, a wider range of topics. And I'd like to pick up something that David has just referred to as well. The first off is that I suggest to you a number of areas where I think it might be worth examining in discussion with the government, looking at the budget in relation to the council tax standstill, which is set to continue, as I understand it, for the remainder of this Parliament. Some of us have different views on that. I consider it technically to be regressive, but I think there's little point in discussing that because we could go on for hours and hours. There are a number of technical aspects. One of them is that I've become interested recently in the immensely challenging task for valuers of setting a valuation for new properties, and we are indeed encouraging the building of new housing and the improvement of older housing, which has an impact on council tax banding, of trying to attribute a 1991 price to a property which is being sold in 2013. The initial data that I've looked at, and I've looked in the sense of having scanned it, suggests that that is throwing up a fair number of anomalies. It's uprating properties that are newer and leaving those that are older, whether occupied or for sale, in a lower council tax band. That has implications for both revenue and indeed equity across the home ownership community. The other factor is the current level of incentive payment for maintaining a council tax standstill, which started off at £70 million a year, has continued at £70 million for the past now 5 years. And your own, or rather the government's local government finance report shows that in effective terms, if you employ a GDP deflator to that over a number of years, the real terms reduction in the value of that 70 million cash has been 0.7%, 2.7%, 1.5%, 2.8%, 2.1%, 2.1%, without taking account of this new financial year. So the 70 million is not worth what it was when the Concordat was first arrived at. And this may not be germane to budget discussion, but I believe it is in the longer term. The committee, I would encourage you to discuss with ministers what happens next in terms of the property element of local government funding. My observation globally is that when you freeze any kind of charge for any significant period of time, the consequences when you try and either remove that freeze or change it quite substantially are often quite dramatic in their form. I do use the term, and I won't say it out loud, but you can see the impact in different countries where prices have been changed. An area that I've spent quite a lot of time looking at recently, and indeed over a number of years, has been the separate matter, which is the extent to which councils levy fees and charges and use fees and charges to generate income. And there are a number of local authority services where the direct charge to individuals or households or families or businesses indeed is quite substantial. Parking is the most obvious one. On-street charged parking is the most obvious one. I don't criticize that, incidentally. I commend it as being an example of an extremely effective modernized service, and people who bleat about paying parking fines have only got themselves to blame, and you won't get any sympathy from me. On the other hand, there are services where there are significant charges that are levied. My observation across local government, across other public bodies, including central government, is that public bodies are generally very poor at making strategic decisions on charging. i.e. why they charge, how much they charge, the manner in which they charge, and the variation on that, which means that you find enormous variance in charges, not just between different local authorities, but as within any given jurisdiction for different services. So I think it might be worth exploring that a little more. It is a growing aspect of local authority financing. It has changed quite substantially over a number of years, but we don't yet have data to see the impact. Elections always have an impact on increases in charges of every kind, i.e. just before an election they don't go up very much. Just after an election they go up quite substantially. We don't have that year's data yet. And my final point would be about I noticed the SCBO evidence on cooperation between local government, voluntary organisations. Seems to me, Convener, that is an extremely good example of clashing policy drives from within the Scottish Government. Much emphasis has been made on efficient and tough procurement that will not just be applied to buying water flasks and buildings from private contractors. Once you get into a tough procurement regime, it applies across the board, and voluntary organisations are in exactly the territory that at one level government and its ministers have urged on public bodies, i.e. get the best value you can for public money. Consequence of that is that prices are often forced down through competition, and competition between voluntary bodies. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'll start off by asking almost the same question that I asked the Accounts Commission at the very beginning, and that is, we're seeing, according to the Accounts Commission information, an increase in reserves at this moment in time, in these very tough times. Can I ask for your comments on that increase in council reserves? Is it a case of councils maybe cutting too quickly, or is it a case of councils planning for the future? Professor Bell?
I'm not absolutely sure I've got a clear answer to that. It may be that, for example, the target reductions in staff costs, offering some incentives for individuals to leave, and then find that more people left than they expected, and the consequence of that is that reserves might build up. It may be that they're anticipating the difficulties that I've already alluded to going forward. But I'd have thought it would probably be the case that it was more unanticipated than anticipated, and that would have potentially negative consequences for service provision.
Professor Kerley?
I'm probably, well, no, certainly less well equipped to answer that question than your previous three witnesses. My observation would be this, that the level of reserve in gross terms across 32 councils seems a large slug of money, but in comparative terms and in respect of the proportion of a local authority budget, it's not a substantial percentage figure. You would have to test the extreme case, which would be to say no reserves at all. Would that be acceptable? Would that satisfy the Scottish Daily Mail or whoever goes on about this? I would expect one would need more examination. So, for example, the figures are not immediately available. I would expect that both Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire councils would have seen a fairly substantial increase in their reserves because of the delay on the Western Peripheral route. I may be wrong in that, but if they have a commitment into the capital programme for that, similarly other councils where there's been a delay in capital projects or a delay indeed in revenue projects, but that's intuitive, and I haven't looked at the detail of it.
We're talking about reserves in the main on revenue budgets rather than in capital budgets here. You mentioned welfare reform, Professor Bell. Do you think that maybe some of this is councils prepping up for for what's about to come in terms of welfare reform? Is there any evidence of that out there?
Well, I haven't followed that closely, so that's not something that I can answer authoritatively on. I mean, certainly there, looking forward, there are likely to be difficulties, but I have no specific information about what local authorities may have done in preparation for that.
Okay, Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I just want to pick up initially on something that Professor Bell said in his opening remarks, and then perhaps extend it to ask Professor Curley, since he is a Professor of Management, and my questions are related to the issue of management. Professor Bell, you said that there's demoralisation of staff. My first simple question is, what objective evidence do you lay for that?
What I think referring to actually was the evidence that has been provided to the committee, looking at the papers that have been provided. Now, whether that is, if that's entirely objective, I don't know. But what we are, looking at the labour force in general, we are detecting that workers are less happy than they used to be, and in particular, workers are unhappy with the hours that they are working. They'd like to work longer hours than they currently have offered to them, and that's partly due to wage freezes on the one hand, and the increase in prices ongoing on the other. So they're finding that their pay is going not as far as it used to.
One piece of objective evidence, which of course plays two ways, that we do have in front of us from the Responding to Challenges and Change report from the Audit Commission published in March, is on absence, where Exhibit 16 and paragraph 110 in the report talks about this. And it's generally thought, I think, in management that where there is distress, in other words, stress has led to distress in staffing, that you would see absence rise. However, we actually see over the period 2008-9, 2011-12, a pretty substantial reduction in absence. Now, it is, of course, explained that there has been a focus on absence management, so I think is ambiguous as to what it may tell us. But that's the only piece of, if you like, numerical data that are in front of us that I can look at that tells me something that touches on the subject. And I'd be interested just to hear what you think that comes from.
Professor Bell?
I think that could go either way at the moment. When people are worried about their jobs, if they're, they may go to work more readily with a cold or whatever than has been the case, than might have been the case in the past, and people are concerned about, or they're more concerned about their employment situation than they were, say, 5 years ago. So that effect, and I agree also that clearly there has been a focus on absence management. Not quite sure how to interpret that evidence.
Professor, want to have a stab at that, Professor Curley?
Yes, there has been a focus on handling absence management in local authorities and indeed in other public bodies over, say, the last 5 or 6 years. Historically, the rate of absence amongst some public service sectors has been higher than the comparable all private sector data where it's available. I've always been sceptical about this being a general phenomenon, because the mix of employment is often typically very, very hard to compare. So, for example, I can fully understand how somebody who's up at 5:30 in the morning and emptying my bins at 6:45 in the morning in the rain right through the winter is probably going to feel is going to have a variety of illnesses and aches and pains that he or she wouldn't have if they were working in a hotel reception for 6 days a week and so on. I think absence management and the focus on that has been part of the explanation for the reduction in absence. In other areas, other aspects, I'm not entirely persuaded that what's often claimed as evidence is awfully persuasive. David's point about, I understand that entirely, the wish expressed by many employees to work longer hours reflects those forms of employment where our flexibility is much greater. Typically in public service, in local government, part-time employees are in the main not on 0 hours or similar contracts. They tend to be on a defined 16 hours a week or 12 hours a week contract. They might want to work more, but they're working in the job they are in at the moment. The other is the often reported stress studies. Well, they have some value, but the people reporting stress studies often tend to be advocates of stress being a phenomenon in that particular work setting, whether it's primary teachers or secondaries or social workers or whatever.
I'll just make an observation which I don't require comment. I think stress is good. It's only a problem when it becomes distress. In other words, some stress motivates too much. It's difficult. Can I just pick up the point I raised with the previous panel, looking at perhaps Professor Kerley as Professor of Management in particular, as to whether councillors are, in your view and experience, adequately supported, trained, mentored, etc., to be managers in any meaningful sense, to be able to help develop strategies and oversee their implementation, even if you conclude that they are more functionally equivalent to non-executive directors in a business setting than executive directors. Are they supported and equipped to fulfill that role? And if not, given that we have a relative paucity of elected members compared to other jurisdictions, should we be doing more?
Well, can I start at the tail end of that question? I am not a great enthusiast for the notion that simply because France has 37,000 communes and 300,000 councillors, we should adopt that in Scotland. I think there is an argument either way.
I come in and agree with you.
Right, okay. Well, we're agreed on at least one thing, possibly only one thing. The dilemma that has always faced bodies where there are elected representatives, whether a parliament and a government or local authorities or some other bodies, is what exactly are the capabilities and the capacity that you're seeking in the people to whom you elect there, and should you seek to determine that in some way they are technically qualified? We have always taken the view that in electing people, and I think this is broadly held across a variety of elective democracies, that we seek people who represent their fellow citizens. Some are well equipped, some are not. Some have resources, personal resources, social capital, that others do not. How do you complement and support them when they are in that role? I chaired a government working party in 2000 where we argued for and made a point of writing down really simple statements about what support councillors could reasonably expect. And it included, as I recall, things like provision of a phone at home for those, and paid for by the council, those who didn't have it, provision of secretarial and support and research services. I would be loath to draw the analogy with the position of yourselves here in the Parliament. I don't think that is a direct analogy, because being a councillor is achievable on a part-time basis. And
bench councillor. What about a convener of a finance committee on a council compared to a backbench MSP, for example?
A very different position, convener, and I would fully accept that. It's hard to distinguish, though, about the extent to which the convener of a major functional committee or an executive member, depending on the arrangement, how he or she draws support from within the functional department or entity that he or she is notionally responsible for as a non-executive, often quite substantial. So you will find in many local authorities that whoever is the education convener can draw on resources within the education department, as opposed to drawing on resources that are allocated to them as a councillor. We could always do more.
In terms of finance, though, and I think this is one of the points that Mr. Stevenson was trying to make, where a convener or executive member for finance is having to very carefully monitor what is going on, is an over-reliance on finance staff sometimes detrimental because that convener executive member is getting the story that he or she would get in the reports anyway, which may not have some of the hidden factors in behind. So in terms of scrutiny... I guess I give
my classic answer, which is it depends on a wide variety of factors. I would always encourage and generally assume that in an effective organisation where there is an effective lay representative, i.e. that councillor, that convener, that he or she is having discussion with people outside the formality of the written report, rather as you yourself will do as convener of this committee, I assume, that members will do as well. And it's the dilemma of all organisational decision-making that lay members, non-executive members, whether of a PLC or a public body, have always got less information than the executive members. And whether that is accidental or a consequence of the arrangement or indeed deliberate. I mean, if you look at some of the major finance debacle in big American quoted companies, you will find that even the most distinguished lay members, Enron had 3 professors of finance on its board, had a qualified auditor chairing its audit committee, and all of them missed the big spectacular hidey holes that people chucked money into. We could do more, but I'm not convinced that creating personal support is the right way to do it.
Professor Bell, if you ignore my devil's advocate question there and go back to Mr. Stevenson's point, please.
Well, I accede to what Richard has said. I don't think there's a general recipe that is going to work. There are particularities of every situation, and as much support as possible is clearly to be recommended. But the in-house team will always have an information advantage.
I wonder, however, whether, and it's kind of like being a minister, it's kind of like being an MSP, it's not about having the information, it's about having the questions.
Yes.
And having a structured approach and confidence to ask them and to play things back. I mean, like, the first thing I asked today was simply to play back something that's been said to me and say, I want to know more about that. And then to make a judgment about how that person has responded. And how well do we equip our councillors in particular to fulfil that role? How easy is it for them to find the questions that they should be asking? And like a jury, who are lay people in the legal system, if you like, make a judgment about the quality of the response that is not simply based on their having the specialist knowledge that the technical expert may be providing. I mean, how are we doing?
Gentlemen?
It's not so much, it's at least partially equipping people with the capacity and the information to ask those questions. It's also about encouraging people who are non-executive and lay members to have the confidence to ask those kind of questions. I read earlier today, I read an interesting, what I understand is a Twitter term, which is desk head or head desk. I listened to a councillor from Edinburgh on the radio, commented on it about 18 months ago, must be longer now, where he said, how could we be expected to know? We're not engineers. We couldn't have known how the tram project was working. And I was head desk thinking that's not your job. You're not an engineer. You're the person who in a closed room or a private meeting or even a public meeting should keep saying, why is it X amount over budget? Why is it not working? Explain to me as though I were a Labrador or a child. Just tell me what's wrong with this. That's a tough cultural change to put to people. It takes about 3 months to hold an elected office before you stop asking questions which are of that direct form. That's a rough judgment, but you can see the absorption pattern in any elected position, that people soon get to the point of saying, I better not ask this because I'll look like a fool. It doesn't bother some elected representatives, Mr. Stevenson.
Mea culpa. I think the only, genuinely, and I'll just make the observation, the only silly question is the one you don't ask, you know, because you're inhibited. I would just follow up on, you referred to, for example, having an auditor on the Enron board, and of course auditors are accountants who are working to rule, and therefore feel more constrained than perhaps even ordinary accountants. Are you better having diversity in your review body, whatever it is, and how do you encourage that? I mean, it's the iconoclast who's going to ask the question, who's that those who are part of the system won't ask.
Brief responses, please, gentlemen.
Sorry, we're getting very philosophical.
Yes.
He's going to rein me in immediately.
Absolutely.
I mean, I certainly go along with that. You know, having bunches of 50-plus-year-old white males is not necessarily going to give you the kind of diversity that you need around asking the daft laddie questions. It seems to me.
So can I just very
briefly, Mr. Stevenson?
Is there enough public engagement on these issues? Because, of course, the public have this awkward habit of asking these questions and not having the 3 months experience that leads to inhibitions. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
No, there isn't. There could be more.
Thank you. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. In your opening submissions, you both referred to the third sector and the information we'd received from them. For example, they've said that they're fully signed up to the Christie Commission principles of doing things differently, but they're being asked to do the same for less. Local authorities hide behind dwindling budgets and excuse not to offer multi-funding to third sector organisations. Now, if I could paraphrase your comments on this, it was welcome to the real world. Local authorities can flex their market muscles, so live with it. Is that unfair?
That's essentially what I said, that, you know, you've got a monopoly buyer of say, care services. And monopolists always tend to exercise their market power. And unfortunately, the third sector is at the other end of that particular bargain. And, you know, albeit we referenced the Christie Commission and the cooperative nature that people hoped would follow therefrom, as Richard said. These principles tend to get shoved aside when budgets get pressed very, very hard.
Professor Carney?
I'd agree. I wouldn't put it as harshly as welcome to the real world, but it seems to me important to understand that in the procurement process that is now engaged in across a wide variety and sometimes an absurdly low level of procurement through formal means. If you look at Public Contracts Scotland, you will find ridiculous tenders being put onto that particular site. But there are a variety of actors seeking to procure, a variety of providers seeking to provide. So third sector organisations, particularly the big cross-country third sector particularly care organisations, are competing with each other as much as they are competing with the proposal or the request from a local authority, and you will find them offering varying bids and varying prices. You can't attribute any one to any particular organisation, but it has become a market. And that is a process which, as I said earlier, the government, and indeed I believe all parties represented in this Parliament, or most of them, have encouraged. More efficient procurement means specifying what you want, making it clear what you expect the outcomes to be once you've procured that, and getting a good price for it. And price variation in contracts awarded is pretty dramatically broad. It's interesting to look at.
Well, certainly we've looked at getting a good price, but also key to this and underlying it, and I don't see this coming through in your analysis at all, is value for money in terms of providing a better service, in recognising that the third and voluntary sector are more flexible, often have the local knowledge and the experience to deliver a service that is in fact a prime example of preventative spend. And I don't hear that coming through in your analysis.
Apologies if you don't get that, if I'm not conveying that. I mean,
well, it wasn't mentioned at all, in fairness, in what you said in your response.
I think you then have to look at the totality of the environment in which such organisations are working. You can look at major contracts for services that have been let recently, and you will find that, for example, they have been won by some of them have been won by third sector organisations who at the point of bidding have no geographical or social relationship with the area concerned at all. It's not uncommon to find an organisation based in Edinburgh or Glasgow, or indeed Aberdeen, bidding for a contract in some other part of the country. So they may be good organisations, they may have expertise, but over-claiming for the alleged virtues of those organisations doesn't do anybody any favour.
I would suggest that also bringing up examples where there is no local connection isn't a fair assessment either, because I think if you look across the board, then the evidence is, and we know this going out as a committee, third sector can do things better, but often are strangled by one-year funding instead of having the three-year funding that allows them to do it more efficiently. And that's money spent every year committed on personnel trying to make bids. So where does this factor into, okay, the market forces which you mentioned and we recognise, but I have to say I'm disappointed in you today in not factoring that into your response.
I regret that. I would argue for a longer period of sustained funding for service contracts of that kind, of funding and support from public bodies of that kind.
To Mrs Mitchell's question there, because at the very beginning, Professor Bell talked about the spending review that's currently taking place at Westminster, and we heard George Osborne yesterday trumpeting about the fact that they'd already found 20 billion of cuts. You talked about a spending review which would follow automatically after the next UK general election, if we actually see that here. Is it these short-term spending reviews, particularly when you've got an election coming up too, which goes right down the system, which actually causes so much grief, instead of the long-term views that are taken in many other European countries, particularly the smaller ones?
Well, of course, local government is so dependent on funding in Scotland from the Scottish Government, which in turn is dependent on funding from the UK Government, that decisions, the time horizon of the decisions that local government can make is dictated to a large extent by the time horizon that the UK Government will hold to. So I agree that, in an ideal world, it would be good to have long contracts, established relationships, another thing that Mr. Bailey, I think, mentioned earlier was that it is actually very difficult to measure outcomes, which that's another way of saying actually it's quite difficult to know whether you're getting value for money as such. And in that environment, it may be the case that local authorities find it quite difficult to offer the kind of certainty that that we might all agree would be desirable.
Again, you're talking about measuring outcomes, and we've had the SOAs for a very short period of time, yet we're all wanting to see measure these outcomes and see what difference that has actually made. Again, do you think that we're maybe taking that short-term, simplistic view, which we wouldn't have if we had longer-term spending plans? So I'm saying, does the view that comes from Westminster in the main of short-term spending reviews actually make us want to know exactly what is happening with every penny at that moment in time, rather than taking that longer-term view?
Well, I mean, that absolutely applies to the preventative spend agenda, because you may spend money now and only realise the benefit 10 years, even 20 years hence. I mean, if you, the classically evidenced aspect of preventative spend is early years interventions for young children. And you may not see the benefit of that till they're teenagers, then further benefits when they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on. So, if you have a very short-term view that's determined by budgets that are, year to year, more or less, then it seems to me to be very difficult to get that proper focus on the preventative spend agenda.
Yeah, just very briefly, local authorities have just undertaken a benchmarking exercise. Have you looked at that data and come to any conclusions on the basis of it?
I can't say I've come to any conclusions. It provides interesting data. I think it's been slightly overclaimed as being novel, and the first occasion this has been done, there's significant amounts of information which have a long time series to them, which are included in that information. But it is interesting as much for, and this I would argue is always the potential advantage of collecting benchmarking data, is to see to what extent are we, as an organisation, I would argue it should best be used by an organisation, to say how far out of line are we, or are we in line with what others do. So if you took two specific instances from dramatically different councils, the cost of council tax collection in Fife, my recollection is it was reported as being somewhere in the order of £2.60 per household, as opposed to a Scotland-wide figure of about £9–10. The cost of residential childcare to Shetland Islands Council, across the Scotland figure of about £4,000, was somewhere in the order of £10,000. Now, I haven't had a chance to check if the figures are actually technically correct, but the variation is so dramatic that if I were at either council, I would be saying, what are we doing here, or what are others doing that we are doing apparently so differently? Some of the data doesn't tell us anything fresh at all. So we know, for example, that in sparsely populated areas, the islands groups, Argyll and Bute, Highland, to a lesser extent Borders and Dumfries and Galloway, the cost of education and social work services is much higher per capita per household than it is in tightly concentrated urban and semi-urban areas. But there's a wealth of material there and elsewhere that, as John Bailey, I think, referred to, councils should be looking at.
With respect, Professor Cowley, that's probably stating the obvious that we knew before the benchmarking. But if we go to voluntary organisations, they can tell us, for example, that for every pound spent, they can save £14. So what from that benchmarking data can we look at to try and improve, Professor Bell, the outcomes that you say are so difficult to measure?
I'm not sure I understand the point you're making.
The point I was making was that they can, voluntary organisations, third sector, know the service they're delivering. They know the outcome of that service. They can measure it. Now, surely the whole point of benchmarking is not just to say you're failing in this service. It certainly wasn't that. It was to see how you can do things better, how you can achieve value for money. So hopefully somewhere there would be the triggers that would lead to preventative spend, more long-term spending, rather than the short-termism. Professor Bell.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to me that benchmarking exercises are really useful. I mean, we've got a great example this morning about collecting data that hasn't been collected before. It appears that in England, it's certainly not a good idea to have an operation on a Friday, you know? So the question is, you've got the information. It may have been tedious to collect, and it might be objected to as being bureaucratic exercise, but then you've got this startling finding that it's something like 40%. Your chances of surviving an operation are 40% higher if you have it on a Monday rather than a Friday. So the question then is what you do. So there may be, you know, the benchmarking exercise is the first step. Then you have to have the processes there to say, well, maybe we can reduce the variation across local authorities, or maybe, given some outside information, that there are other ways of doing things, we can take that into account and adopt quite different structures given the difference. But it's these processes that, I'm not an expert on this, but it's these processes of taking the information that you've collected, that's what I do, and then making use of it in decision making that seems to me to be the key element of this.
Absolutely, thank you.
Stuart Stevenson, a very brief supplementary there.
I just wanted to use the NHS example, which I've had a wee look at, to illustrate some of the difficulties. Yes, outcomes are worse on a Friday. But why is that? Is that because the patients are not refreshed by having just completed a weekend? In other words, is it the patients going into the system? Is it because the doctors and nurses and practitioners are exhausted after a week? Is it because the theatres only get cleaned properly at weekends and therefore infection is higher on a Friday? In other words, isn't it always the case that when you do these analyses, the good analysis will actually give you more questions than you started with?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's an element of that. My listening this morning did suggest that they managed to eliminate exhaustion at the end of the week as a possible explanation, but there may be others that they still need to check. Yes, I mean, you do have to kind of zero in on the key issue, but certainly there's, when you observe something, a big variation that's difficult to explain, that should be a trigger to
more questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have experience of the recent benchmarking exercise, but I have looked at variations in the costs of care across local authorities for a very long time, and I've always found them a complete mystery as to why there is the variation that we do see.
I've got to be very lenient here. Margaret Mitchell.
I think the main point is, and it comes committee after committee, a lack of data. Now what the benchmark finally gives us is some data. So from there we can do a lot. I think that's the point.
Okay, grand. John Pentland, please.
Thank you, Convener. Spice's briefing has shown over the last 15 years that the Scottish Government's funding to local government has shown little variance. Yet we know that nearly 14,000 people have left the authority. We've seen cuts to services. We've seen increases in council charges. We've also seen that there's some funding uncertainty for the third sector. And I was wondering if you believe that this time is right for a local government review and how it's funded.
Who's going first? Professor Curley?
Well, we've had several of those. They generally tend to produce an outcome which is potentially highly disruptive for citizens. Therefore, citizens are likely, some of them at least, are likely to make a considerable noise about such disruption. and elected representatives tend to not be keen on that. John Bailey, who was with you earlier on, was part of the Burt review of local government taxation in Scotland, a report which was dismissed by the then First Minister, Jack McConnell, and by the Leader of the Opposition, Alex Salmon, within a day, half a day of being published. I thought it had quite a lot of merit to it, and I thought it had potential advantage in the scheme it proposed of being somewhat more progressive than the step banding of council tax. But bear in mind that that only addressed a very small proportion of local government funding, much of which comes in shape or form through general taxation systems and is channeled through this Parliament. I equally think that any review which is about the shape and form, structure of local government is immediately diverted into a discussion of boundaries, which is one of the most fruitless exercises that anybody can engage in any shape or form. So at the moment, I think you've got a lot on your plate, and I wouldn't go in for that kind of review. I remain of the view that the current council tax system is not a very good means of taxing property. It's made even worse by the standstill on council tax. One of the reasons why I suggested you ask ministers what next, or even so.
There's a lot of discussion of taxation going on at the minute, so maybe it is a time where at least some of this does get discussed. I was actually wrote the research report for the Burt Committee, which Jack McConnell dismissed within a day, where we proposed a land tax to replace the council tax. The council tax is now ossified, as Richard has said, and I recently, having built a new house in Dornoch, got an assessment of the value of that house, but run back to 1991 values. It's meaningless to me. I have no idea what whether it's accurate or not. We are also, of course, taking over stamp duty land tax in Scottish Government, so that's going to be another tax on property. Neither of these are ideal taxes on property, to be quite honest. One taxes transactions, so that it slows down the market. The other, as Richard says, is quite regressive in that it doesn't hit those with the very largest houses to a greater extent or massively greater extent than those with relatively modest houses. So, and actually, as the Spice paper shows, council tax is now just about to fall behind NDRI as a source of income to local government. So things are going on because we've left the system for a long time, and it has some significant anomalies. Of course, overlaying all of that is that even if we move around the existing pieces on the chessboard, local government will still only raise a relatively small proportion of the resources that it spends. And that is not an ideal situation. It does make it, in a sense, less accountable. And of course, with being less accountable, that has consequences for the interests of the electorate in local government, maybe for the quality of the people who want to become councillors and so on. So I'm moving outside my brief here, I think, but it does seem to me that local government, we shouldn't assume that just a few small tweaks to local government finance could provide a really much better system than we've currently got. There's a way to go on that.
Sir Pentland.
I think just to take a leaf out of Professor Kerley's book, could I have a yes or no as to whether you think there's a requirement for how local government is funded? A review for local
Not in the current circumstances, with discussion about possible independence and therefore regime change in the sense of proposed taxation change. I would not do that as a freestanding exercise. I agree with David that as part of a broader review of public financing and taxation, there would be a case.
Professor Bell?
There are ongoing change. There's lots of discussion about taxation in Scotland, but mostly at the moment at the Scottish Government level, rather than of changes at local government level. I think Richard's right. You probably have to leave it a couple of years at least to see the outcome of the referendum before you enter into that particular area. But it does seem to me to be unfinished business that at some point the Scottish Parliament ought to be addressing again.
Mr. Pentland.
Thank you. Professor Kerley, in the past you made a comment that just calling something strategic does not make it so. Decision makers need guidance, not rota templates, as to how they make choices between various options for resource allocation. Without such clear guidance, then the game to be played by all organisations will be how they can best present their special case as meeting these objectives. To what extent then do you think that the Scottish Government budget approach qualifies as strategic? And what would you suggest as a strategy?
Professor Kerley.
Within a minute.
Well, within a short period of time, maybe a bit more than a minute.
Right, I'll stand by that line that I used before, and I'm just trying to remember where I said it or wrote it, that simply labelling something strategic doesn't make it strategic in its form. It's a good way to win friends, influence people, and sometimes to generate more money. And part of the skill set of many public officials is defining their particular current project or enthusiasm or something which they think is a good idea. May be a good idea, but if you wrap it in the label strategic, you're more likely to get support for it from the financial paymasters wherever they happen to sit. I think fundamentally argue that one of the difficulties of the non-executive, the executive role in local government and elsewhere in public bodies is that too often the broad strategy is not clearly set, and councillors can often think they are engaged when they kind of push and prod at the edges of a particular direction. If you look at the overall shape of what we're trying to do, you will find that we actually haven't shifted budgets in Scotland a great deal in recent years. And I have to step back from just councils alone, but an area where this Parliament has recently had some discussion about it is in relation to, say, looked after children. We really haven't done a lot for a very small subset of the youngster population in Scotland. We haven't done a lot very differently in the recent past than we have done for previous decades. They still get an incredibly rough deal if they are children in care, whether directly in care with the local authority or in some other form of non-institutional care. And the consequence of that, as we know, is that a far higher proportion of those looked after children will graduate out of Saughton or Polmont than they will out of a university or a further education college. We could have made a big, bold step that would have a number of elements to it where we could have said, we're going to do something about these kids who, by dint of having absent, dead or feckless parents, are just left to bump around at the bottom of society.
The Education Committee of this Parliament is looking very much in depth at that particular issue at this time, and I'm sure the members here will look very carefully at that. Mr. Pentland, thank you. Mr. Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. It's just really to go back to some of the issues that have been raised in the comparisons in relation to the voluntary sector and the pricing regimes that local authorities seem to apply when putting out contracts. Now, we have a definition, best value, and both Professor Bell and Professor Kerley, you've indicated that you feel, well, what I've picked up is best value is not being applied in the way that some of us actually perceive best value. And best value is to make sure we got the best delivery of service, not the cheapest delivery of service. Do you think that we currently have at the present time an attitude within local government that it's about delivery of a service at the lowest cost rather than delivery of the service at the best that we can actually deliver a service? And the analogy I'm looking at is one that was used earlier in the earlier session, is about the pothole. Local authorities go along, fill a pothole in, go back 6 months later, fill it in again. Rather than tackling the real problem, all they're doing is filling the pothole. And do you think at the present moment best value is not being applied by local authorities, and we need to review best value to actually make sure we are getting the best delivery of service within a value regime?
I've never accepted, Mr. Wilson, that you can generalize across all, local authorities as a whole. It's even actually hard to generalize within a particular local authority. If you look at all 32, and some of them are extremely hard to compare to others, but look within the big family, you can find very good practice in one part of a local authority, and in the same local authority, quite poor practice. And if those of you who've been councillors or had direct relationship with the local authority will know that in X, somebody will say they've got a great social work department, but the highways people are just really not up to it. I think best value is a very, very difficult concept. It is not the cheapest and should not be the cheapest. But it is a fine balance between specification, whether people can deliver to that specification, and whether you can get, as between those who can deliver that specification and to that specification, how you get a good price out of that in overall terms. And that's not a trivial consideration. My answer to an earlier question, I said if you look at qualified tenderers bidding for different types of projects, you can find a huge variation in the successful bid and the unsuccessful bid. And you have to say if the variation is 100% in terms of price, then somewhere in there's something in significance in that particular price signal. It's a very fine balance. As I've said, it's a fine balance to get, and I would not generalize from that one. Some local authorities are doing it well in some areas, less well in others. And it's changing over time as well. But this Parliament, this government, is, as I've said as well, is partly responsible for saying procure better, procure better. That tends to mean more elaborate forms of procurement. I looked at a procurement document the other day for a relatively low-cost project with a local authority that ran to 80-odd pages. And I've looked at procurement documents issued by the Scottish Government for relatively low-cost projects that run to 50, 60, 70 pages. It's in the nature of that emergent exercise.
Professor Bell?
I agree with Richard that there is wide variation across local authorities. It does seem to me to be important too to consider who is deciding what is best. I noticed one of the papers for this for today's session discussing self-directed support, and in a sense, self-directed support puts the question of what's best in the hand of the consumer. Now, I haven't followed exactly what the outcomes of its relatively new policy. It's interesting to see how that's developed. But certainly, who decides on the specification, it seems to me, is very important. And going back to the issue of preventative spend, who decides on the time horizon over which the best value will be calculated is also vital, it seems to me. And of course, that takes us back to the question of how local authorities, how certain they can be over time about their own budgets. So it is a very big issue, but I completely agree that best value and lowest cost are quite different concepts.
It's interesting, Professor Bell, you use self-directed support as an example. One of the most common complaints I receive from individuals is that the people who are making the finance assessment on what should be provided for that self-directed support feel that they're actually being, the cost is being reduced in terms of what they're being offered for that self-directed support. So therefore, what they can actually see being delivered is very much determined by the money released by mainly local authorities. So there is an issue in terms of that example. But to go back to the question that John Pentland, or the issue John Pentland raised, and he gave a figure, and I know, Professor Bell, you've used this figure in the past as well, of the 14,000 job losses in local government over a period of time. And what we've actually seen, because you used the example in your introduction about people who want to work more hours, and whether that's part-time workers or people who are on full-time contracts but want to work overtime. But in terms of the 14,000 job losses, are they straight job losses from local government, or are they, as I've posed this question to you previously, job losses that have come off the books of local authorities but have actually been put on the books of ALIOs and other organisations as straight transfers? And I think one of the examples that was used previously was in Glasgow's situation, where they actually transferred 3,000 staff to an ALIO, and I know that other local authorities are transferring staff from local authority budget headings into the ALIOs. And it's how do we measure the real level of job losses in local government over a period of time if all what we're doing is saying a transfer, a sleight of hand, effectively, for various reasons, transfer of staff from local authority, direct local authority control into ALIOs.
Can we try and keep responses brief now, because I'm aware that time is moving on. Professor Bell.
As was reported in your by the previous group, it is very difficult to get accurate numbers on these ALIOs, the extent to which people have been transferred into them. Of course, they are in a different situation once they're in an arm's length organisation. Clearly, their terms and conditions may not be the same as they were previously, and these kinds of definitional changes can have big impacts. One of the biggest is has actually happened down south, the transfer of further education into the private sector, which is actually 200,000 jobs have moved as a result of that. This is an important issue, and my attention has been brought to it frequently, but I have not found a way of actually getting the numbers, other than, I suppose, going and asking individual local authorities, which I have not done.
Thank you.
There are two dimensions to...
Briefly, Professor Curley, because the question was directed to Professor Bell.
Apologies.
You can, but very briefly.
The manpower, staffing data, it used to be called manpower, for local government and other public bodies in Scotland is now ONS, Office of National Statistics, compliant. And my understanding is that ALIOs they are quite distinct from a contract let to a voluntary organisation or a commercial provider. I think ALIOs are incorporated in the figures for staffing in local government. The curiosity in England that David referred to is incomprehensible to me, that further education is defined as private, whereas the two major banks that we rescued are now defined as public service employees. And I can't make
Stuart
sense.
McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Gentlemen, just I've got a few questions. The first one, I think it goes to the nub of the wider funding and debate over local authorities. Do yourselves see the local authorities more as facilitators or the deliverers of services? Or on what do you think it actually should be?
Both.
Both from Professor Curley, Professor Bell.
Well, I also hope that the they facilitate the expression of the wishes of the local electorate. It seems to me they have to have a role as that, but they surely are not just deliverers of services now.
Mr. McMillan.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, because just obviously in terms of obviously the papers that we've got certainly for today, obviously Professor Kerley in your paper, on certainly page 2, when you highlight the issue regarding the figures of fees as a percentage of costs, one of them that struck me was the issue of the museums, libraries and policing. But my reading of this is that also that the local authorities actually pay more, so they're getting less money coming in. With this particular example, are you suggesting that local authorities should actually be charging for likes of access to museums and libraries, etc.?
Mr. Kerley.
No, but I am suggesting there should be a more considered discussion of what we charge for than is the case. Much of it is an historical legacy. It strikes me as curious that it's assumed that I can walk into a museum and pay nothing, but if I want to go to the theatre or a music event in a public venue through a publicly supported company, we all assume it natural that I pay for a ticket. I'd find it hard to justify either, and I think that it's just legacy.
Thank you. In the paper that we've received from the SCVO, it's on page 2 under the heading of clawback. In paragraph 3 of this, they highlight obviously the issue of well, certainly paragraphs 1 and paragraph 3 highlight the issue of profits being returned back to the public sector from certainly from the sector that the SCVO represent. But certainly in paragraph 3, it states that it's also worth noting that this occurrence does not happen with the private sector. Is there an argument there for local authorities to really challenge the private sector when they actually are delivering services for the public sector, to ensure that actually some profits do go back into the public sector?
Yes, I think there's an area there which is about how you write contracts in different shape and form, and it's now accepted in a number of dimensions, and as between private and private, that if a contractor generates much more profit than was originally anticipated in a proposal, that there should be a clawback of some kind. I mean, we all learnt the hard way from PFI in its early years that it can, through nobody's intention, it can balloon into being immensely successful, and everybody then says, well, how did that happen? Well, because you didn't write the right contract.
So,
Sir Bell, do you want to?
No, I agree with Richard on that point.
And just one final question. It's the submission that we received from Sam H. On page 4 of their submission, and highlight the issue. It was at the bottom, the penultimate paragraph. They highlight the issue of the UK government's welfare cuts, and they state that they've been shown to be impacting disproportionately on disabled people, and therefore increased charges from local authorities for social care services at a time when benefits have been reduced will hit service users doubly hard. Is there an argument here for the local authorities to potentially consider increased usage of service delivery with the third sector and voluntary sector, as compared to potentially maybe trying to kind of bring more services in-house, which may actually have an adverse effect upon the clients who actually need these services?
Professor Bell.
Well, I mean, this is just going back to the arguments that we've already talked about a bit. You know, whether you take them in-house or whether you contract them out, it's really the local authorities' decision as to what extent it's driven by the best value agenda. And it may well be the case that contracting out would appear to deliver better value. Of course, one of the interesting things about charging disabled people, and it harks back to the general welfare issue, is that Scotland decided for the free personal care legislation that it would be restricted to those aged 65 and above. And effectively, the UK government has also pretty much protected those aged 65 and above from any welfare cuts. So all of these difficulties are particularly focused on those of working age, of the disabled of working age, it seems to me, who are in a very difficult situation now.
Professor Kerley.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with David. I think, and in response to your what I think was your suggestion, I would have hoped to see local authorities doing more to facilitate access by disabled people to pre-existing services that they're entitled to. Back in the 1980s, a significant number of local authorities put enormous effort into benefit campaigns, because we know that one of the consequences of a complex array of discretionary benefits and services is that the smart get everything and the less well-informed get a lot less. It's a common phenomenon in all forms of specialist support, ranging from special educational support to support for physical disability, that some people draw on everything available to them and others are left isolated, unequipped.
Okay, no, that's helpful, thank you.
Final question, gentlemen. In your opinion, is the welfare reform proposals that are being put through at this moment in time going to be the greatest pressure on local government in the next few years? Mr. Bell?
Well, the demographic change seems to me to be one of the absolutely key issues facing local government, because an increasing proportion of the population is going to be aged 65 and above. Now, the welfare cuts are a reflection of the fact that the economy has not been doing as well as one might have previously expected, particularly in the period 2008-2013. Unless the economy starts really to recover, then the interaction of a slow-growing economy and demographic change is going to produce huge difficulties for local authorities, it seems to me.
Mr. Kerley.
I don't know that I'd rank them, but in my view, I'd echo David's point that I think the kind of demographic change we're seeing, and we've tended to focus all our interest at the top end of the scale, older people. We are not, in my view, paying sufficient attention to the demographic changes occurring at the junior end of the scale. That and welfare reform will be key factors, but the inescapable is the broader economic climate. We have some parts of Scotland which are struggling at every level and every dimension. We have Livingston City Centre, sorry, I've promoted them. Livingston Town Centre, one of the most popular retail destinations, very, very, very low empty shop ratio, and you go to Cumbernauld, Glenrothes, Irvine, and you find high streets that are really struggling. Leave aside all the more smaller towns that are scattered throughout the country. So three key factors: the general economy, demographic, and then decisions by governments on welfare. I don't like that word, on social protection changes.
Thank you very much for your evidence today, gentlemen. I suspend this meeting for 5 minutes, or about 5 minutes, for a change of witnesses. Okay. Thank you. And we move on to our third panel of witnesses today. And we're joined by Kate Higgins, Policy and Communications Manager for Children First, John Downey, Director of Public Affairs for the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, Fraser Kelly, Chief Executive of Social Enterprise Scotland, Callum Irvin, Chief Executive of Voluntary Action Scotland, Nancy Fancock, Policy and Development Officer for the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland, Rachel Stewart, Policy and Campaigns Manager for the Scottish Association of Mental Health. Welcome to you all. Most of you are not a stranger to this committee. I think we'll just start off by questioning, and you may wish to give a wee comment at the very start as we go on about where your organisation sees the position at this moment in time. Obviously, the committee has been embarking on its PSR inquiry over a period of time, and there has been some very good input from your organisations round about that, and a lot of what we have seen is your organisation saying how you can help in terms of retaining service delivery during the course of this current economic climate, and how procurement has been quite difficult for you. I wonder if I could start off by asking you round about the difficulties that you have with procurement. I wonder if you've maybe got examples of good practice in parts of the countries and examples of bad practice too, because we always hear about the good and not necessarily the bad. And if I could maybe start with John Downey, please.
Thank you, Convener. I think I've just reminded me of your discussion this morning. I think the last time we were around this committee table, your advisor asked a question when you indulged them to say, what do we think of best value and what its definition should be? And you know, I think everybody was in agreement. It's not just about the money, it's about the best outcome, the best service, and actually, but I suppose, the key issues in some of your early discussions about the heart of procurement is actually we're not doing it and taking a co-production approach. We're not seeing service users, you know, at the heart of actually designing services and deciding on the outcomes that they need. Now, that may be for a particular services if it's around children's services, but equally, in your discussions about local authorities, it's actually not about what outcomes and what do people want to see in their own communities. And I think it's a democratic deficit and people's input in all of these areas that is really important. I mean, we saw that in the last local government elections in Scotland, 37% of people voted. Now, local government is totally disengaged from people and communities, and I was also struck by the last time around this table that the official from Edinburgh City Council said the amount of participation that people get to have a say in the budget for Edinburgh City Council, I think was 300,000 out of the £20-odd million budget he was referring to. And actually, that's part of the key issue, whether it's around procurement in terms of the type of services we want to see and the best outcomes, and in terms of actually what we're looking at in terms of what we want to see for communities and individuals. In terms of procurement itself, I mean, if you take a couple of key issues, you know, in a lot of contracts at the moment, that what we're seeing is that there's kind of lip service paid to community benefit clauses. I think the guidance around it is quite complex. It needs to be clearer. But actually, what you'll see is, a company will take on 6 apprentices for the length of the contract. Well, that might be 18 months, that's 2 years. That's totally unacceptable, and it's not in the spirit of the way we want to do it. So what we need to see is things like community benefit clauses taken to a higher level in terms of broader social economic impact, but actually made a commitment to how do we make community benefit clauses and that social impact much more sustainable over a longer period of time. I mean, for example, it's an absolute nonsense that say small local organisations should be imposed and have to take on an apprentice, which is quite, it's quite a cost, when actually year on year they are employing people from local communities whose wages are spent in that local community. So I think the whole thing about procurement for us is, one, it's currently too bureaucratic, it's driven by cost, and actually they're not thinking about outcomes, and there's no participation in service users and third sector organisations who are delivering those services.
Do you think it's that the emphasis on cost is because of the short-term budget settlements that come right the way down from Westminster to local government?
I mean, I think cost is always a factor, but I think actually, it's more cultural and actually not thinking about actually what is the base value, because actually the culture doesn't think about outcomes. They are not thinking what's the best outcome, and that's part of the problem. I think everybody comes back to procurement and public services reform. We keep coming back to culture and how things are implemented. We can have the best procurement bill in the world come September, but the way it's implemented will be the key to all of this.
Very brief supplementary from Stuart Stevenson, because I do want to get round all of the
I just want to pick up on the community benefit in relationship to apprentices, and I think local authority and government contracts, where it's suggested that they're only taken on for the duration of the contract. Have you examples you can give us where, rather than it being an apprenticeship through to the completion of the apprenticeship, which will be longer than the 18 months suggested, where that's happening, because I'd want to know about it.
We can certainly try and do that, Stuart. Certainly, if you look at what's happening, say, south of the border with the Social Value Act, and actually what's happening in a lot of local authorities there, take Manchester City Council, for example, working with the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. What they're trying to do is change behaviour in both third sector organisations, private sector and the public sector to actually make sure more money is spent in the local community. So they're creating more jobs, more spend in local businesses, and becoming miles ahead of it.
Others want to answer Stuart's question as we go along, that would be grand. Anne McTaggart, you've got a wee supplementary as well to add to the mix.
No, it's not a supplementary. I'll come in later on. Sorry,
okay.
It's a different question.
Thank you. Callum, do you want to deal with the first aspects,
I mean,
please?
I think our membership is composed of what are now known as the third sector interfaces in Scotland, local volunteering agencies that support all aspects of the third sector. And although they work with all of the third sector, a very large part of their activity will be towards supporting smaller community groups, social enterprises and volunteers. And what a lot of them are very good at is brokering local activity to kind of have that community impact. Very good in terms of things like mitigation around welfare reform, or, for example, in terms of preventative agenda, they can play a bigger role in that. So one of the things that I think is quite challenging for us and our members is that we don't want to see everything being done in a procured fashion, because the scale is not there in terms of the local third sector to meet the scale of procurement contracts that we're talking about. So for a relatively small investment, third sector infrastructure locally, and indeed others locally, some of the larger charities as well, can broker activity that actually ends up meeting community outcomes and some of the objectives of local authorities. I'll give you one anecdotal example, but I'd rather not give you the specific local authority, but if that's okay. But one local authority was on the verge of procuring 10,000 lunches locally in the local authority area. The third sector interface, the local organisation, stepped in to point out that actually something in that order was being delivered by local community groups together in the local authority area. So part of the role here is a need for the local authorities to understand better what the third sector is and what it could do, and then creating, allowing the relationships that can make the most of that.
Kate, please.
Yep. Wanted just to start by apologising to the committee that you've got me today and not our director, Alison Todd, because she's actually at the Early Years Collaborative and reflected back. We had a conversation this morning just about it's a two-day event, and yesterday John Swinney, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, held central sway and seemed to have been the person who challenged the most and who had everybody talking last night afterwards, because he went with quite a challenging message for the Early Years Collaborative and everybody participating in that. And it effectively amounted to that we need to get our act together and start spending better. And a great phrase, stop feeding the machinery and start seeing the people. And I have to say that listening to the earlier evidence this morning from the two professors, I got quite despondent that we got into a discussion about process and machinery and about and just about the value and about whether and about the contracts. And to some extent, this is an extension about it, and perhaps Children First maybe comes at things from a wee bit different, but we do so safely under the umbrella of having CCPS to represent our interests as a service provider. But our focus with all issues around procurement and base value and contracts and cost is that what we all need to be doing is focusing on what is in the best interests of, from our perspective, it's vulnerable children and young people and families. And to some extent, it doesn't matter who actually provides the service, but it's about whether or not that service is best meeting people's needs. And to some extent, you know, again, around it, when I looked at the benchmarking framework that's been established, again, my heart sank. You know, this is all about inputs and outputs. There's nothing in there about outcomes. It's actually data. We've created an industry around gathering data and more information about inputs and targets, rather than, and we still haven't bottomed out how we are going to measure outcomes. But to some extent, there are some obvious things here. It's about what works. And it is actually about, and procurement is part and parcel of the same. I think the most depressing thing is that we're still having the conversations we were having 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and even longer ago about equal partnerships with local authorities, about the nature of procurement, about what constitutes best value and what isn't happening. And we still come up against the same obstacles. We are facing the same challenges as all our other service provider partners and organisations that we work closely with and alongside about contracts and tendering processes. We have made decisions to go for some tenders that have been utterly unrealistic, but that is because we perhaps, and it's not a luxury, it's a conscious decision as an organisation to maintain a very high fundraising base, and at the moment we are currently operating 50% of the money that we spend in a year is raised by us ourselves, because we made that conscious decision some time ago that we would always protect our independence and protect ourselves against the hard times that we're currently facing. But we make those decisions because to go for such contracts because we think we are best placed to deliver that work. And on other occasions we don't go for tenders because we know that there are other people who can do that. I think more generally with regard to procurement, and if you actually looked at what happens at budget setting time, there's clear evidence that local authorities are not taking a strategic approach to how they are re-provisioning and cutting and changing how they deliver services. We have had instances where we've had a few days' notice of very long-standing services going, and that's the first inkling we've had of it. And again, it's not about us being aggrieved that we're losing that service, although obviously we are, because it creates huge issues for ourselves, but also for families that we've been supporting. Because it may be that ultimately where that service goes or what replaces it is better. But it's to some extent that is about the process of transparency and about local authorities engaging in panic budget setting and making cuts rather than taking a more strategic view, working with local interfaces, working through their CPPs and engaging with their service provider partners to look at what is realistic. We all know the financial difficulties, but we're all, you know, if we all got round the table, we could actually do something a bit more innovative and a bit more creative to work out how we're going to continue to provide the services that they obviously want to still continue to do. And then just on the procurement, there just needs to be more transparency entirely in that process, however it's worked.
Wee supplementary from Margaret Mitchell, please.
Yeah, you mentioned your heart thinking about, you know, the talk about value for money. Where the academics actually came from in the first instance was purely price. Absolutely. They didn't even mention value for money. So in order to get them onto where you want to come from, as I understand it, which is better service, this is all about people, then that must come under the value for money. Now, I think we all recognise that local authorities are not going to hand you a contract on a plate because you smile nicely or you say you've got a better service, and that's where we're going down to the benchmarking and them having to prove that what they're doing is better value than, I assume, Children First can can produce the data to say that they do it. And I say that because your submission came in very late last night and the committee didn't see it till this morning, which I think is a great pity, because we would have been able to look and maybe find some examples from that.
Yeah, I apologise for the delay in sending through the submission. With regard to the benchmarking framework, there is a tiny amount of data provided about, and it's only actually about looked after children, and it's actually data that was already in the public domain and that we already had access to. The benchmarking framework is telling us nothing more about outcomes or even about how much local authorities or is being spent or is being delivered for the most vulnerable children and young people in our society that we didn't already know. And I think that's a huge gap and a weakness in what's been provided. So it's not that we're against what's been provided, but I think, you know, given that it's been an exercise that has been set out there with some fanfare, actually an awful lot of that data was around, and we're not knowing that much new in terms of, and there are a lot of obvious things that were picked up in the evidence earlier around the apples and pears of trying to compare, for example, the costs of provision in rural versus urban authorities in some areas. But actually, for the area of children and young people that we're interested in, that exercise has produced absolutely nothing new that we didn't know already in terms of looked after children and young people. And actually, and it's a key example if the Improvement Service had actually engaged with the third sector, because ourselves and indeed Bernardo Scotland and I think Aberlour as well, three of the big providers of children's services, we all have developed our own outcome frameworks. We are measuring outcomes in what we do for children and young people and families that we work with, and they could have had access to that to support their exercise.
But isn't that the point? The fact they've provided that information gives you the opportunity to go back and say, right, that gets us so far, but where is, and take you the step further on. I think that was the point of it.
I think it would be very interesting for this committee to catch sight of your outcome frameworks in terms of our move forward with PSR3 at a later date when we go back and revisit it, which we most definitely will.
Happy to share it, Convener.
Rachel Stewart, please.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about how SAMH believes there's a bit of a disconnection between what is a national strategy for mental health and the local commissioning by some local authorities. Obviously, last year the Scottish Government published their mental health strategy, and we were very pleased that it was so comprehensive and that it received such wide support across the Parliament. It's not just about the NHS, and that was something we were saying all along. It includes commitments on criminal justice, employability, trauma, and also on the balance between inpatient and community services, of which SAMH provide over 60 across Scotland. Basically, on the final area, we are worried that there has been so many cuts in spending and reductions in high level of supports which harm the chances of achieving some of the commitments within the wider national strategy. And the Scottish Government has made this such a big priority, and we're just not seeing it being commissioned and delivered on the ground. Also, from a national organisation point of view, we face challenges in procurement discussions with 32 different local authorities. Everyone has their own system. This is very labour intensive for us to try and make relationships and so on with a lack of consistency. And finally, the lack of negotiation offered by some local authorities has been really, really hard to deal with. They've just been putting something on the table saying take it or leave it, and promoting a very low ceiling where we can't really pay our staff what we think they're entitled to.
Thank you. Nancy Fancock, please.
Yes, thank you, Convener. My colleagues have made a lot of the points that I was planning on making already. Thanks for that. But you know, CCPS, I think, has been working on the issues of procurement for a lifetime, it seems. And we've put in some quite detailed representations to the consultation around the bill. But I think for social care and support providers who are our constituency, procurement is mostly all about getting the same kinds of services that have always been provided, but just for less. there's very often difficulty in finding the connection between procurement exercises and the strategic planning that may or may not be being done within local authorities. And it also very clearly highlights this problem of the power imbalance that's been spoken about just now and earlier on in the submissions. Power imbalance between this sort of market monopoly that local authorities have and the third sector, who believes that we have lots of very positive solutions to contribute to the challenges around public service reform. And I think that is the other aspect of it, is that it is a process that is imposed on potential service providers without any kind of negotiation, without any kind of collaboration, without any kind of common consideration of what the needs of a particular community are and how we might best address those needs. And I think that is how we understand the messages of the Christie Commission, is all about that kind of an exercise. We don't actually think that procurement, for the most part, is an appropriate tool to be using in relation to social care at all. And that's one of the points that we've made in the procurement consultation. We think that things like joint strategic commissioning, which is something that's being developed in the context of the integration of health and social care for adults, holds much greater potential as a framework for us to identify proper strategic planning and proper connections between what kinds of outcomes we're aiming for and how we're going to get there and how we might address them. Just one possible alternative to the use of procurement as it is now. And I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you. Before I bring in Mr. Kelly, is there something that we can do with the microphone sound? I don't know if it's just me because I've got sinus problems at the moment, but the volume seems to be quite low. I don't know if others are experiencing that or not. Just me, is it? Okay, adjustment made. Mr. Kelly, please.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of Social Enterprise Scotland, our members consistently tell us that they, in bidding for contracts through procurement models, they meet performance thresholds regularly. They meet quality assessment and quality standards and assurance methodology regularly. They meet the financial capability and financial viability assessments. The areas where they don't compete well are on price and or on discounts. And I suspect there's one other area which we find challenging when working with local government, with public agencies, is the inability that we have to evidence to them that value which allows them to take an assessment of whether it provides a better net present value to the finance director to take one service or one proposal over another. And we've not yet, I think, fully understood or fully represented well enough how that outcome valuation is assessed. There's a number of issues that John mentioned about service design and where community benefits are going. I think community benefits are far more sophisticated now than they have been for some time. I think we've moved away from the capital contracts being obliged to take 10% of the new entrants into that contract have to come from people who are unemployed or seriously disadvantaged. Where I think we're moving to now is local government and indeed statutory agencies actually buying services from the voluntary sector and from social enterprise. That for me is a far more powerful mechanism than it is obliging them to build something into a procurement model which obliges a provider to do something. It's the adage about give a man you give the man the fish, give a man a boat and a fishing rod. I would rather we bought services from people. Then they will actually create the market. If the market is created rather than controlled, it creates a far more effective mechanism for the third sector and for social enterprise to participate there, rather than it does in the current environment at the moment, where we are effectively delivering services in the design that has already been mapped out and provided before we actually get to the table. We're not in that early stage design that John mentioned at the start, whether it be in terms of the people who use our services or the people who are actually delivering the services.
Before I bring in Anne McTaggart, in terms of service design and community involvement, and there's been lots of talk of lip service. Many local authorities say that they bring in the community and other organisations at a very early stage when they're trying to redesign services. Very briefly, how often do you think that happens? Is this the norm or is it extremely rare? Anyone any different from extremely rare?
I think from the perspective of social care providers, it's on the rare end of the spectrum.
I think that's very useful. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener, and welcome to the panel members. Having read, I know it was a late submission, but I've managed to scroll through it, the Children's First, whereby I'm going to pick out one of the elements in it is befriending, and coming from a social work background, it was just so important that we had the voluntary sector there I was local government. But now that we're finding that there's demise of these community services, how are you coping with that?
Higgins.
Yep. I suppose our we put in two examples of work that we do, Children First. Any of the children's service providers could have pointed to the kind of early intervention services that they do, that increasingly local authorities are deciding not to fund, not to commission at all. And I think our frustration is that it totally, I think somebody made the phrase this morning about the that you've got competing drivers, if you like, almost happening in government policy and around cost and the cuts to services, and yet actually everybody is, as evidenced by the people who are all involved in the early years collaborative yesterday and today, people are still trying to find ways to work collaboratively, to put money in early intervention and into preventative spending. But when it comes to the crunch, when you're having to make budget decisions, increasingly what we're finding is that local authorities are choosing to pull money out of some of the low-level, quite cost-effective intervention activity, and that's the frustration, because, and partly it is tied up with the short-termism of funding arrangements, it is tied up with the austerity times we're seeing, and it is absolutely tied up with the culture of how we go about setting budgets and designing services and putting through. And I don't know what the answer is, because everybody's at the stage of banging their heads off desks in terms of how we change and shift that culture and move money. And I would say as well, just to go back to the top of our submission, is that de facto there are cuts coming through both in what in what's being spent by local authorities and also in Scottish Government allocation into children and young people. And yet if you asked anybody, if you asked COSLA and you asked the Scottish Government, they would all say that children and young people remain a priority. But we need to actually then, and we're not saying don't make the cuts necessarily, we're saying let's have the discussion, and if we're going to make cuts, let's make a strategic decision about that, and let's make an open decision, because what's happening at the moment is the slicing effect rather than, and it's kind of hidden in there. And while, and we would want to have that debate and discussion, because we would actually come along and say don't make cuts to children and young people, because the impact in that is an increase in child poverty, particularly for vulnerable children. We know that that's an outcome that we're then trying to battle through other spending interventions.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Totally agree with Ms Higgins. It is like a false economy in a sense, because as a worker, as a frontline worker, their families and the communities need every single one of the community activities that are going on there, whether it be the befriending service or the mental SAMH, or they need every one of them. But if they're not there in the community, it's just a false economy then, because then things start to escalate and their conditions start to escalate, and before you know it, we're accommodating or thereafter. So not only you are frustrated with that, Ms Higgins.
And Ms Higgins mentioned salami slicing of budgets there, which seems to be the norm. Can I ask if any of your organisations at all have been involved with any local authority in terms of priority-based budgeting exercises to stop the kind of salami slicing that Ms Higgins was mentioning there? Anyone at all? Callum?
I mean, what I could say about this is that, I mean, third sector interfaces have a small amount of funding from the Scottish Government to partake in community planning, both to actually be a community planning partner and then also to facilitate other third sector engagement in community planning. But the problem with that is that it's a very, firstly, it requires considerable resource to be able to do that, and as set against the statutory sector's resources, the interfaces don't really have, if you like, the research behind them, the staffing behind them, and so on, at the same time as they're trying to participate in various public service change agenda. So, as you say, in order to, as some of the discussion earlier on in your previous panel was about the ability to interrogate information and manage information and understand what is happening. And those kind of that infrastructural resource doesn't exist in the third sector in order to be able to, if you like, interrogate that information sufficiently and then to be able to add to it and change things.
Yeah, Ms Higgins said earlier on that there are already frameworks in place regarding outcomes for various organisations. I would have thought that in terms of priority-based budgeting exercises, it may well be that councillors in particular would be wanting to look at not only cost implications but also outcome implications about doing certain things. So, I mean, I understand that you may not have access to lots and lots of different data. I would have thought that the data that you do have, the frameworks that you do have, could be brought into play in these scenarios.
I'll just make one more point on the back of that, is that you know, the jargon at the moment is about resource sharing, but that doesn't happen. So if you're trying to participate in how can those limited funds be used better, effectively community planning in a lot of cases works like this. People come to the table with what they've got, but as Richard Kerley said earlier on, those spending patterns have hardly changed. And while we're talking about preventative spend, mitigation, and if you like, shielding the worst of cuts impacts on communities, unless we actually got into real resource sharing where the third sector could influence, then take part more effectively as it would see, then I don't think that you have an exercise where it's more difficult to gain the outcomes that you can see are needed in communities.
I think, I'm sorry if you think I'm being harsh here, but your fixation there seems to be on the resource, the money, as we're hearing is the fixation of very many others in terms of the value for money aspect. I would expect you to go to the table not necessarily to talk about sharing huge amounts of money, but sharing huge amounts of knowledge which may lead to different decisions when it comes to a priority-based budgeting exercise. That's my point. Mr Downey, you wanted to...
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, Convener, because actually what the sector can bring is that facilitation role, the voice of the service user, as Kate was talking about earlier, actually what are the best outcomes to how best serve. I mean, I think we've got a problem in local authorities at the moment that I think some of them are forgetting they're there to serve the people and not to serve themselves. You know, and I think, you know, that there's a real strategic issue, and I think you talked earlier on about, you know, councillors and I suppose in a sense the quality of councillors, and I accept it as difficult, and we have that kind of, I suppose, the leadership both from, you know, an executive and from a, you know, an elected member kind of perspective. Yes, we would see it needs to be better, it needs to be more strategic, but actually a lot of the time is, are they talking to people about the vision for their own community? And then actually, if you think about it, what are our priorities, as you say, where are we going to invest now? When I talk to senior staff at local authorities, I'm still amazed that actually, if they get people involved in participation in the budgets and making decisions about their community, people are well able to make tough decisions and actually say, we've got 3 choices here, we've got money for 2, we will do that. And actually, to be honest, it gives the local authority a lot of cover because actually people have been involved and made that decision. And I still fail to see why they're doing it. People are prepared to make tough choices in communities, and actually, but it'll be based on what they think. Now, you don't please everybody, and that's a kind of cultural change that's happened. But the third sector's got to bring its voice, and I think, as Fraser said earlier, we do need to prove our case as well in terms of the outcomes we can deliver, the added value, and Kate's outcomes and other people. You know, there's a lot of great outcome stuff in the third sector that's there, frameworks and other ways of doing things that we can show, but actually it's got to be taken seriously and actually shown. You know, people got to take it to make a difference when they're thinking of contracts or how they commission work. I mean, commissioning is probably a much more effective way of using the third sector than contracts, as Fraser said.
John Wilson, please.
Convener, good morning, or this afternoon, sorry. The issue for me, to follow on question, is that can anyone on the panel give an example of engagement with elected members in discussing delivery of local services?
Who's going to have a crack at that? Fraser?
I think that there's some local authorities who are far more progressive than others. At the moment, West Lothian Council, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Falkirk, Dundee, North Lanarkshire and Argyll and Bute have all identified now social enterprise officers either within their Chief Executive Service. So,
I'm asking the question about engagement with elected members, not officers of the council, because one of the problems that we're picking up on, and it goes back to the earlier panels for those that were sitting in the earlier panels, is that the engagement here seems to be with officers. Officers are doing the procurement process. There seems to be a lack of exchange or interaction between the elected members who make the decision at the end of the day about the contracts and the service delivery. And what I'm trying to get to is there any engagement, any organisation, give me an example, where they have direct engagement with elected members regarding the delivery of services that your organisation delivers prior to contracts being awarded?
Rachel?
So,
Fraser, do you want to come back?
Can I just make one comment? The appointment of those officers is a direct result of engagement with the elected members in each of those local authority areas.
I still think that is not the point that Mr Wilson was trying to make. And in some regards, I have to say that, in my opinion, that gives the officers, even more cover in terms of stopping direct engagement, because you've now got an officer specifically for you, but that's an opinion. Rachel, please.
Thank you. We have a service in Montrose where we work with what was previously the local mental health association, and one of the local councillors sits on our joint board with that association because he's aware of the work that we do in the community. He's very supportive of it, so we have that relationship with him.
I think that's very interesting, because that smacks of the champions that have been put in place in various other areas. And what I've found is that you often then get rivalry between the champions to see who is the best champion, which actually mean that there's resource diverted to the winning champion, if you like, which again can lead to some more difficulties. Nancy, sorry, I'm giving too many opinions here. And they're getting your questions answered, John. Nancy.
Yes, thanks. We had a recent experience. Unfortunately, it's not prior to the contract being agreed. It's after the fact. And in the context of a lot of public lobbying against a decision of a council to make an across-the-board cut to the entire voluntary sector service provision group within that area. And we went to meet with the head of social work and the convener of the health committee and another officer. And it was a very interesting experience, because we realized, which is something I guess we probably already know, that there was a lot of sympathy for our concerns within, with the officers. There was a lot of interest on the part of the elected representative who was there, who didn't really know what was going on. And there was obviously a lot of unstated power sitting with the head of finance in the council, who we don't normally interact with because we deal with the social work people. So it was provided, and the practicalities of a national organisation like ours who lobbies on behalf of providers dealing with elected representatives of 32 local authorities is a bit mind-boggling. So I'm not quite sure how we do it and how our resource-pressed local providers are going to do it as well, but it's something that we're all thinking about because it's clearly important.
John Downey, you wanted to come in?
Well, I think I can give you quite a good example, but it relates to welfare reform actually, and we used it in our recently published mapping report on welfare. It was actually Inclusion Scotland, and they were invited in 2011, I think September, to take part in a welfare reform conference in West Lothian, and there was elected officials, elected members, there was council officials there, and obviously presentation went down quite well, and actually the council leader invited them in to make a presentation, and that led to, there was a council leader and the council executive, that led to presentations to heads of services. But actually now, if you see the partnership there with the third sector and the council in terms of welfare reform and mitigation, it led from the start because they had the political leadership and they had the buy-in from everybody there. And that's quite a good example, but again, I would say that's a rare example of maybe engagement with elected members, except very localised organisations, I would think, community organisations who do engage, but taking it further up in local authority, I think it is rare.
I think, Convener, Ms Fancott's comment, and I've paraphrased her, but I think this is exactly what she said, is that at the meeting that she had with officials and the elected member, the chair of the committee, as the elected representative didn't seem to know what was going on. And I think that's part of the problem that we have in many local authorities, is that elected members, while being effectively the responsible individuals for making decisions on behalf of the council, in many respects don't know what's going on. The other follow-up question, Convener, is, just to throw this out again, is how many local authorities are bringing services back in-house? Because what we've actually seen is we've seen the dispersal of some of the services to voluntary sector organisations because local authorities thought it would be useful for those organisations to deliver those services. But how many local authorities have now decided, in your experience, to bring those services back in-house for whatever reasons?
Nancy?
Can I just come back on the elected representative who doesn't know what's going on? I don't want that to be misunderstood. But what was interesting is that the local authority was describing this budget cut as something that would come out of the admin costs of provider organisations. And I think this is probably a way to make it palatable to the elected members, who might not realise, in the case of most of our member organisations, that 85 to 90% of their operating costs are staff costs. They can't take 5% out of 10%. Realistically, what's going to happen is the impact is on the workforce and on potentially the quality of service. So it's in that respect that information is provided in the context of these difficult decisions. And just quickly on the point about taking services in-house, we don't have any proper evidence of this, but it is something that we are picking up anecdotally. And I'm also thinking about the discussions that have been going on earlier this morning about the ALIOs, because there is at least one local authority who has decided to put all of its social work services into an ALIO. And so that's another way that this kind of thing is manifesting itself.
And that kind of monopoly, putting all of your social work services into an ALIO, does that mean that there's likely to be more restriction on your members actually getting any contracts or being commissioned for any services?
That's one of our concerns. I mean, it just doesn't feel very fair from a competition point of view.
Kate Higgins, please.
Yeah, we have directly been affected by decisions made to take services back in-house or for councils deciding to deliver them themselves, where they previously commissioned our organisation, Children First, to deliver those services. to come back to your first question as well around the elected members, one of my jobs is to work closely and encourage all our local services to develop good relationships with all their elected members. So we try to do it before, so that we do have them to call on if we need them. But we try to do it as part of a more kind of grounded way. I have to say that one of the things that would be quite good is just for elected members themselves to be more proactive about, you know, because a lot, you know, not every charity or third sector organisation has a policy team, and ours is quite small, but we still have one and can support our local services to do that. But, you know, most of them are more than happy to open the door. And I think there's something in elected members about being more proactive about engaging with what's going on in their doorstep as well as the other way around. On the bit about services going in-house, where I've looked at budget proposals, because they affected us, around budget papers for local authorities and what was going on, there are ways of, officers are reading between the lines, elected members are being told whatever in order to justify that going through, and there's no opportunity to question that, to scrutinise the rationale going on. One example I can use was where they took a service away from us and used that money to then provide a bigger in-house service that they claimed by year 2 would be saving the council over £1 million a year. And, you know, who's following up on that to see whether or not any of that investment has actually come to fruition? Because the theory's good, but actually we might argue that as a voluntary sector organisation, we could save them more, you know, and if they had just continued to invest in us rather than move the money in. So there's an awful lot of kind of rationale being applied that I'm not sure how much is being scrutinised, and about how information is being presented about the impact on the voluntary sector. But it's quite clear, if you look at any of the budget setting papers and strategy documents from this year, there is clearly what can only be described as a bit of a circling of the wagons going on, and that stuff is being brought in-house more often than not, or that where they're taking new stuff, they're deciding to provide that themselves as going outside. And we would just come back to, that's fine if that's the best way and that's delivering the best service for the people that it's supposed to be for.
We're getting very short of time, so brief questions and brief answers, please. Stuart McMillan, please.
Oh, thank you, Convener. I've actually heard quite a tremendous amount today, which has been very useful. But a question for Rachel in the submission. You talk about the SAMH is currently undertaking a survey of our 2,500 service users regarding the welfare reform. When is that survey due to be published?
We hope to publish it during either late July or in August, because obviously it's quite a big endeavour to reach all of our service users. We are running a survey alongside it of our service managers to see how the impacts of welfare reform are affecting the delivery of our service, as well as the individual impacts on each person that we support. So we'll be publishing the two together, hopefully in August.
Will there be information broken down, whether it's at local authority level or even kind of parliamentary regional level?
We can probably do that, yes. Well, the way we have designed the service, it's by the actual service, you know, so our support workers are working with our service users to gather that information. In terms, we can identify which services in which local authority or parliamentary level.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Thank you very much. We have had a very short time today, and one of the things which I always find, and I think committee members would agree with, is we always hear about good practice, and we've heard about West Lothian again today. What we'd be interested in is in some of the authorities where you are finding it very difficult to engage with them too, and give examples of that. That would be really useful. If there's any other information you can provide about the in-house services, taking things back in-house, which has been detrimental, again, that would be extremely useful. Kate says during the course of one of our last interventions that it would be good if elected members actually engaged. And I think in some regards, as a former councillor and now as an MSP, one of the things which, you can get bogged down in getting a huge amount of policy documents through, but some of the best ways of actually recognising what a service does and what the outcomes are to be invited to see some of the services. And some organisations are much more proactive than others than doing that. And councillors seem to get less of those invitations than MSPs do. So what I would say to you is go out there and suggest that councillors come and visit some of the projects and work that you're doing, because I think that is immensely useful. And it is very, very useful, I would say, when they come to make budget decisions. I know from past experience there myself. Thank you very much for your evidence today. And as previously agreed, we now move into private session and I suspend. Thank you.